Hi everyone, welcome to the ATAR Notes Psychology 3 and 4 revision lecture. Hopefully you guys can all see and hear me well. So today we'll just be running through kind of a quick overview of the year in terms of 3 and 4 to prepare you for your exam. So we'll have 2 content blocks and we'll basically just be splitting up unit 3 and 4. My name is Lourdes, Loz is fine as well. So yeah, we'll just be running through it. We'll have a question platform as well that you can ask questions on, so we'll look at that in a second. But yeah, I guess firstly, welcome to everyone. Before we do get started today, I would firstly just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm presenting from today, so the Bunwarong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So, welcome to you guys to the ATAR Notes lecture. You guys may have, been to one of these before, perhaps in 1 and 2 last year, or you may have done one earlier in the week. So ATAR Notes has been running these lectures for a while. So it's just like a really great resource that's run by, a couple of recent graduates to do kind of almost like a little crash course in terms of what we're studying today with Psych 3-4. ATAR Notes has been around for a while, and there's a couple of resources online that you can check out of theirs too if you head to the link just there in the bottom left. So yeah, you may have done their lectures or seen discussion forums and stuff like that as well. But on our website, you can see there's heaps of free resources that you guys can check out, particularly like around this time of year before your exams coming up soon. So obviously lectures, again, you may have been to ones before. Study notes as well, you may have seen them. As I mentioned, ATAR Notes are pretty well known for their kind of forums, so their discussion, so you can ask questions, to your peers who are kind of going through the same thing, as well as learn some tips and stuff from, people like myself, like recent graduates who have done it as well. So if you're looking for kind of, tips from people who've been through that, then head to discussions and ATAR Notes sort of forums as well. There's also a couple of revision videos, ATAR Calculator. Again, I know ATAR Calculator is used a lot around this time of year, and a lot of other new things that may be of help to you, whether for Psych 3-4 or any of your other subjects, as well as a lot of stuff to help with kind of uni things next year as well, or any other kind of tertiary course, TAFE, anything that you're looking for there. So yeah, head to the website. It is brand new, so it's been kind of redone and everything is a lot easier to find. So you can see the Vic resources there. Feel free to access them for anything VCE, and you can search for anything in that bar that you want to look for. But you can see down the bottom, really easy access to your articles, your ATAR calculator, your study notes, and so on. So I really recommend you head to that website if you are interested in any of the resources that we've just talked about. If you are interested in anything else on top of that, we do have a couple of other resources. So TuteSmart is basically the tutoring company associated with ATAR Notes. So like I'm a tutor there, I do psych and bio there as well. And, it's got like private tutoring and class tutoring, stuff like that. So we'll talk about that and kind of like a little bit later in the lecture, some stuff that we have going there in terms of preparation for exams. We also have a couple of study guides you guys may have seen. They cover like, your English textbooks, your course notes or topic tests, as well as Ed Unlimited, which is basically every single ATAR Notes publication, including those study guides and some practice exams as well, online. So it's almost like Netflix, like you just subscribe. And then you can access, all of the ATAR Notes, course notes, topic tests, practice exams, stuff like that as well. So if you're interested, again, we'll talk about some stuff we have going in terms of ways you can access that stuff a little bit later on in the lecture. But we also, you can also just head to the link and take a look there if you're interested. Okay, so this is how our lecture will be running today. So we've got 2 content blocks are basically just split up into unit 3 and unit 4. So we'll do about an hour on each of them. We'll have like a 10 or 15 minute break in the middle, and then we'll have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A at the end as well. So in terms of our Q&A, we're using Slido. You should be able to access it from the page that you got this lecture from, but you can see it here. So good to see we've got a couple of questions already. So we'll answer these either at the break, like depending on time, we'll answer these during the break, or we'll get to it at the end. So we're finishing at about 3:30, so at around 3:15, if not a little bit earlier, depending on how many questions there are, I'll dedicate some time for Q&A. So I'll try to cover a couple of them during the break, but if we're pushed for time, we might do it at the end. But should be able to access it pretty well. If not, you can quickly scan this QR code before I flick back. We'll also have a couple of polls from Slido throughout the lecture as well, so we'll use that too. But good to see your questions coming in, please. keep asking any that you have, and you can see you can like upvote people's as well. Okay, yeah, so that is essentially what we'll be doing there. Okay, so in terms of who I am, so again, my name's Loz. I graduated 2 years ago, so in 2020. So I'm in my second year of uni at the moment at Monash. I did Psych 3-4 when I was in year 11, so I did it. It was my only year 12 subject that year. And so I got a 50 and a Premier's Award. I really, really liked the subject, and I think that's where I can kind of like owe, I guess, like my results to. So hopefully you guys kind of like it as well. It is an interesting topic. I know, you know, if it's not your favorite, you can still kind of push through it, I suppose. But I think if you like learn how to appreciate it a little bit, and like I'm not saying you like, you know, love it if you don't like it, but you can apply a lot of this stuff to yourself. And I feel like that's what sort of like almost motivated me when I studied it, because I found it interesting how, you know, mental health, consciousness, learning and memory, it's all stuff that's super, super relevant to you. So yeah, that's why I found it kind of interesting. So if you have any questions about year 12 in general, obviously exams, anything with uni or anything like that, then yeah, feel free to prop them in the Slido poll as well. Okay, so we'll start off with our first Slido poll here. So obviously just a general question to you guys, particularly about your exam that's coming up in about, I think it's like 4 weeks or so. So what do you guys find the hardest thing about psych in terms of, you know, revision, memorizing and stuff like that? And what are you most worried about for the exam? So I'll activate that poll and you can just pop in anything. Again, it doesn't have to be like a really in-depth sentence, but just some general things about what you're most worried about for the exam, or what you find the most difficult about psych in general. So this can be, yeah, perfect. So this can be like parts of the exam, so extended response, or it can be like actual topics, or it can be, you know, exam stuff in general. Yeah, let me know what you guys think. Yeah. Yeah. So as expected, a lot of stuff on the 10 marker. The 10 marker is, I think, the hardest part about psych, definitely. Yeah, section C. Yeah, I'll let you guys type for a bit and then we'll have a look. Yeah, just seeing a lot of 10 marker stuff. And a lot of research method stuff. I'd say that those are the two trickiest parts, and the parts that students typically perform worse in is definitely the 10 marker and research methods as well. Yeah. Yeah, lots of 10 marker stuff, research methods. Okay. Yeah, so in terms of content neurotransmission, I don't know if I saw other stuff on that as well. Okay. I'll give you like 30 more seconds to get some stuff in as we read through these. But these are probably, yeah, the kind of typical things that I would have expected to see. Yeah, good one in terms of this, like not knowing or not knowing what the question kind of requires or is asking. That's definitely a big one as well. The thing is, like, I'll preface this and I'll talk about it a lot as we go through this lecture. Psych is all about application, all about application. So you obviously need to know the content. But think about the multiple choice, and as well, you have 50 multiple choice questions. That's quite a lot. And you have your short answer, and obviously your 10 marker is complete application as well. So you really need to get used to applying stuff. You have to get used to, it's not questions like that are definition based primarily. It's not like, you know, what is this, or, you know, define this, or like the most, I guess, like simple, like non-application-y stuff would be like explain the process questions, like maybe explain the process of like long-term potentiation or something like that, or explain the process of like a spinal reflex. Like those are the most content-y questions you kind of get, or like least application based. But then the rest, like especially think about mental health, think about consciousness, learning and memory, stress as well. It's really all like you get this person, you get the scenario, and you have to apply it. So for that reason, doing practice questions is really, really vital, because you should expose yourself to as many different types of scenarios and I guess methods of like having, you have a block of content, it's like clay almost, and you have to basically like form the clay, you know what I mean? You have to make something out of this, depending on what the question is. Like it's an application question, and it can all be on the same content, but it'll be asking about it in different ways. So it's really important to kind of expose yourself to as many questions as you can, to try and get comfortable with that as well. And that also comes down to knowing the content well too. So yeah, research methods. Again, we have a section of today's lecture on research methods, and there is a lot of stuff, like in-depth stuff about that. So we'll go through it as well. I do want to say you guys will get a copy of the slides. So anything we don't get to, basically, within this lecture, like there's a lot of content. You guys will know Psych 3-4 is a very big subject. So we'll try to get through it. We'll be going through it relatively quickly. So yeah, we'll kind of run through that. But anything that we don't get to, yeah, you'll have it in the slides, or anything that we don't cover like super in depth, you can refer back to it in the slides or pop it in the Q&A as well. But yeah, 10 marker, we'll talk about the 10 marker and exam tips as well. But yeah, it can be relatively difficult. Again, practice with that, but also understand, again, I'll save it for the exam tips. But things like planning it, allocating enough time, making sure you're clear, making sure you're being like you're relevant, you know what I mean? Like the stuff that you're writing about is relevant to the scenario, to the study design, but in saying that as well, making sure you're adding enough information, you're not being too bare, writing too much. Yep, conciseness is definitely an important thing. Yeah, short answer question. Running out of time, so time management, again, that comes from practice, timed practice. Yeah, biology of memory and learning, so covering all this. Yeah, neurotransmitters. So I'm saying the 3 big things, I suppose, are research methods, 10 markers, and time management. Yeah, definitely wording it. Yeah, because it's all about application. Okay. Yeah. Oh, operant classical conditioning as well. Yeah, this is a really important one as well. A question I get often is like how to get that last mark, because sometimes it's very easy. If it's like a 4-mark question, you'll give 4 points and you'll think you're getting all 4 points, but you like miss out on that last one because basically you're allocating too many words or too much time to those first 3 marks and you're not getting that final answer. Yeah, in terms of English, yeah, English is a whole other thing, enemy for some people. But yeah, English is a little bit tough as well. Yeah, putting definitions in when to and when not to. Okay, awesome. These are some really great things. So hopefully we'll cover most of these. Okay. I'll lock that now, but yeah, hopefully we'll try and cover most of these. And again, we'll cover a few of them in exam tips. But then in the Q&A, we can talk about it as well. Okay. But yeah, as stuff comes up, as we go through it, as I mentioned, we'll be going through it relatively quickly. So I won't like pause in between stuff to look at the Q&A. So we'll either look at it at the break or at the end, but please like ask your questions and don't be concerned like, oh, like she hasn't answered it yet. Like we'll get to it. If not in the middle, then at the end. So please pop in anything you need to. But yeah, I'll make a point to focus on the 10 marker and research methods at the end. Yeah, as well as talk about some time management stuff. Okay, but thanks everyone for filling that out. Again, hopefully by the end of this, we can feel a little bit less worried about some of that stuff. Okay, so start off with neurotransmission. So we have our divisions of the nervous system. Extremely vital. The thing to think about here is communication. The basis of this entire thing is communication. So we have our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. So central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord. Think about things in the center. Peripheral nervous system, things on the periphery. So we have basically all of everything else that's not included in the central nervous system. As a hint as well, with psych, a lot of the terms, they're very true to their name, if that makes sense, like peripheral, central, somatic nervous system. Like it can be easier to memorize them and to think about them. And it can kind of link stuff a little bit more semantically in your brain when you actually think about what the words mean. So that would be my kind of tip, and I'll explain that as we go through and look at different terms. But yeah, central nervous system, think about things in the center, the brain and the spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, everything else on the periphery. Peripheral nervous system, in terms of this idea of communication, it's basically like the peripheral nervous system interacts with the environment. So it will detect what's going on. It sends that information to the central nervous system. The central nervous system will coordinate a message, coordinate a response, will send that response to the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system will respond, if that makes sense. It's all about that communication, and that's how we interact with our environment, essentially. So peripheral then breaks into the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. So somatic, think soma, think body. So it's really your like voluntary skeletal muscle movement, your perception as well. So sensation, stuff like that. So feeling when it's hot, when it's cold, feeling pain, feeling touch, on your skin. That stuff is with the somatic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is basically everything that's automatic. So we're thinking of like our visceral organs and stuff like that, stuff that we're not consciously controlling. So breathing rate, heart rate, hormone secretion, stuff like that is involved with the autonomic nervous system. So then that breaks up in its further two divisions, which are really associated with stress and fight, flight, freeze response. So sympathetic, that is basically activating the body. We're thinking of preparing to tackle that stressor. We're getting like arousal of the body here. So we're getting an increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, pupils dilating, all of that kind of stuff, which we'll see in a second. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is basically calming that down. So most of the time, remember as well that this isn't like an on or an off switch. It's not one is on, one is off. It's like, think about like scales almost. So the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant most of the time, right? When we're calm. And then the sympathetic nervous system, when we get that fight, flight, freeze response, it's that the sympathetic nervous system is dominant. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. It's just very important that you understand the divisions as well. Understand that these two come from this one and that these two come from this one. Okay, so here is a good table that kind of summarizes those changes. So the whole thing with this fight, flight, freeze response or this stress response is this idea that we are getting prepared to tackle a stressor or getting prepared to, it's like promoting survival, and we're kind of expected to run, particularly with fight, flight. Like freeze is a little bit different, but we'll get to that when we cover stress. But the main idea here is like basically energy to the muscles so that we can run. So if we think about our lungs and our heart, increasing glucose, stuff like that, it's all of this idea of oxygen to the muscles, blood to the muscles, so that we can, kind of increase those chances of survival. We're also shutting down stuff that isn't necessary. So your GIT, all of that stuff gets shut down because the body realizes, I'm running away from some kind of attacker here. I don't need to think about digesting food at the moment. And we're getting adrenaline and stuff like that as well, pupils dilating and so on. So just try and remember all of these essentially, because all of them can be covered in terms of a multiple choice question. But in terms of like a short answer question listing, I would remember maybe 3, have your 3 key go-tos. And this is the same for the rest of stuff with psych. When you have lists, have like about 3 or 4 go-tos. Even if you remember like all 10 of them, try to in your mind think about okay, these are the 3 I'll write down, because it just kind of making everything as planned as you can is really helpful. Even if I remember 10 of them, if you get to the short answer and it's what are 3 changes associated with sympathetic nervous system or something like that, if okay, I always talk about pupils, heart and lungs, then you can just go bang 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 and write them down. It's I don't know how many seconds you'll save, but it's just easier having that list and having your go-tos rather than kind of spending time thinking about oh, should I talk about pupils today, or saliva or whatever, stuff like that. So that's the same with all the other lists that we think about. Just have about 3-ish or so and remember them. Okay, in terms of neurotransmission, really, really important. We've talked about the nervous system as a whole and this idea of communication. So this is how this communication actually happens, how it's enabled. So the way that I like to think of it is I kind of think of neurons as bodies almost. I think about the message going from top to tail, or top to toe, essentially. So we have also remember that neurotransmission there's a chemical aspect and there's an electrical aspect as well. So the axon impulse, the action potential, that is your electric aspect. So when it runs down the axon, the electrical impulse, and the neurotransmitters across the synapse, that's chemical transmission. So it's a combination of both. So I like to think about it. So you've had your, your chemical impulse, the message has basically reached the end. So these I kind of think of as the feet. So these will be your axon terminals, and you have your terminal buttons at the end. So they're the little vesicles that contain the neurotransmitters. These, again, will bind to sort of the end of the terminal button and will secrete these neurotransmitters into the synapse or the synaptic cleft. So remember that these are the axon terminals or the terminal buttons of the presynaptic neuron. These will release our neurotransmitters. They'll diffuse across the synapse or the synaptic gap. And then they will bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. And understand, again, when you receive a message, it comes from our head and then it will flow through to our toes. So I like to think of dendrites as hair, to remember that it's like kind of at the top. And the dendrites, the receptors are sitting on those dendrites. The dendrites are kind of what receives that message. So the receptors on the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron, they'll receive that message. You can kind of think of like the soma as like the head basically. And then we get that electrical impulse, that action potential going through the neuron again. And then it goes to your, toes. And then the same thing happens. And then you have, 50 neurons in succession. You've got that traveling all the way through. You have your neural pathway. And that's how communication is enabled. Neurons, how a message can travel from one part of the body to the other through the central nervous system and back. So those are the key aspects of neurotransmission there. And also be able to label a neuron and understand what each part of a neuron is for. Okay, so neural basis of learning, our neurotransmitters that we think about are glutamate and GABA. So glutamate is our main excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA is our main inhibitory neurotransmitter. So glutamate basically makes, so it's excitation. It makes the postsynaptic neuron more likely to fire. GABA is the opposite. Inhibition makes the postsynaptic neuron less likely to fire. So think of like calming it down. So glutamate kind of associated with long-term potentiation, that increased firing of those neurons and neural pathways. GABA is the opposite. So basically decreases long-term potentiation and therefore can lead to long-term depression, just as an absence of glutamate could lead to long-term depression as well. So glutamate equals go, GABA equals slow. Just really, it's key that you remember these. Glutamate excitatory, GABA inhibitory. Okay, so in terms of Parkinson's disease, this is a neurodegenerative disorder. So thinking about neurodegeneration. So the brain structure that we're thinking about is a substantia nigra. Really important that you remember that. So we're getting neurons in this part of the brain dying. So the neurons that are, the usually healthy neurons that occur in this part of the brain, they're responsible for producing dopamine, and this dopamine will act on the primary motor cortex, and that enables us to basically control our voluntary movements, to move our skeletal muscle. If I want to move my hand here, I can move it here. Clean, coordinated, smooth response, basically. So when this goes wrong, we're getting those neurons in the substantia nigra are basically dying, so our neurodegeneration. And this means that we have less of that dopamine production. So less dopamine means we're not getting that dopamine to the neurons in the primary motor cortex. And those signals, think about this in the context of the diagram that we just talked through, the idea of neurotransmission at a synapse level. So basically that is being impaired. That's what's going wrong. We're getting less neurotransmitters in terms of dopamine. And so those signals are basically being chopped up. It's the communication is impaired, right? So then we're getting that in the primary motor cortex, and basically that results in our symptoms of Parkinson's disease, which are that kind of impaired control of voluntary movement. So we're getting things like tremor, for example, shuffling when walking, things like that as well. It's this idea that we can't control these voluntary movements that involve our skeletal muscle because of the lack of dopamine, because our transmission is basically impaired, and the signals aren't coming through. And then that is primarily due to that neurodegeneration in the substantia nigra. So that's an important thing to remember as well. Okay, we'll talk through this. Obviously, we won't get you guys to attempt it, but you can see that, I remember this question, actually, this was the first short answer question in the exam I did, because I sat the one in 2019. And you can see it's very chunky, and I think it took up the whole page. So it's a pretty intimidating question, especially for your first short answer question. But again, just think about it. And again, think about how this is application and what you would write for it. It's also an important question to not assume stuff. So Finn was standing near a campfire with his friends when he noticed the fire becoming hotter against the skin of his legs. To avoid getting burnt by the growing flames, he took a step away from the campfire. The human nervous system has two major divisions. Identify the subdivision of one of these major divisions that activates Finn's responses, and outline how the subdivision is involved in Finn's responses. So think about that, and think about this scenario as well. It's only 2 sentences. And the main thing we're thinking of here, notice the fire becoming hotter against the skin of his legs. To avoid getting burnt by the growing flames, he took a step away from the campfire. So our 2 major divisions, think about our 2 major divisions, so the CNS and the PNS really, and the subdivision of one of these major divisions that contribute to Finn's responses. So, and think about this, 5 marks as well. In general, I would plan this. because it's 5 marks, you can see however many billion like lines it is. It's very easy, especially like I think some of you are saying, you know, tending to overwrite or not being concise, or that idea of not getting that 5th mark. You know, it's easy to write a lot of stuff and think you're getting 5 marks, but you basically like omit the final point. That's such a common thing, and not just in psych, in a lot of other subjects as well. So planning can be helpful for that. But this is what we're looking at here. Again, you can look at the marking scheme. So 30% getting 0. So 3 valid interpretations of this question. Full marks could be achieved by providing identification, blah, blah, blah. So this idea that it's not even just one nervous system that you had to get. You could have done somatic, you could have done the brain, you could have done autonomic. I remember I did somatic. I think for this one, somatic might be the easiest to explain. But again, whatever comes to your mind first, and whichever one you think you can justify, you know, 5 marks worth, go with that. So responses indicating that the spinal cord activated the response were incorrect is a scenario clearly described a conscious action. This is an important aspect. And this is what I mean when I say don't assume questions. Think about spinal cord stuff. Like all of the stuff you guys would have seen is like stuff associated with, you know, they have a lot of hot stuff. So like you touch a hot pan, you know, fire, or like pain, you touch something sharp. So it's so easy to see, you know, burnt by the growing flames. Okay, this is pain. It must be a spinal reflex based on what you've seen in the past. But you need to understand this idea. Noticed the fire becoming hotter, took a step away from the campfire. It's conscious decisions. You're perceiving this heat and you're consciously stepping away. It's not that spinal reflex. Yeah, it's not that when we think about the sensory neuron to potentially an interneuron and then a motor neuron, that spinal reflex arc, and then the brain comes later. That's a very distinct response. And we're thinking about things being instantaneous, registering pain after, whereas this is to avoid getting burnt by the growing flames, he took a step away, as opposed to, you know, he accidentally touched the flames and his leg like instantly jolted back, stuff like that. So it's important to really read this properly. Okay, identifying the autonomic nervous system is valid if described accurately. How a flight response might alert the conscious decision-making system. Again, so that's why it's a little bit hard. I personally wouldn't really go with the autonomic nervous system. I think somatic is a lot clearer in terms of that perception of the heat, coordination of a response, and then stepping back. But yeah, that's an important question as well. Okay, we'll go to a Slido poll. Again, any questions, pop them in the Q&A and we'll address them soon. Okay. So, quick multi-choice. GABA is a what neurotransmitter? That what long-term potentiation? I'll give you like 20 more seconds on these. I don't want to spend too much time because I know we have a lot of stuff to get through. Okay, like 5 more seconds. Okay, results are looking good so far. Okay, I'll lock them here. So this is the correct answer. So good to see the majority got this. So GABA is inhibitory and that will decrease long-term potentiation. So remember, glutamate is excitatory, GABA is inhibitory. Long-term potentiation is the strengthening of synaptic connections. So that would result from increased firing. But remember that inhibitory is decreased firing. So that's why it would decrease LTP. Okay. So in terms of stress, that's it for neurotransmission. Let me know if you have any questions on that. Again, we'll hopefully get to it, but just before the break. Okay, so in terms of stress, eustress and distress. Eustress, positive, distress, negative, really the most basic thing. So eustress, we think about more feelings of excitation. So something like a party or a roller coaster where we're thinking about exciting things. We're not thinking about like detrimental consequences coming from it. Whereas distress is the opposite. So this is negative. So this is when we're thinking of anxiety. Remembering anxiety is this idea of apprehension of something in the future, anger, negative stuff like that as well. And so obviously long-term distress, distress is what we generally think of when we think of like the negative consequences of prolonged stress, because you ultimately don't really have like prolonged eustress too much. And also understand the sources of stress. Like we're not talking about them in depth today, but be able to describe them and understand them. And also for the 10 marker, this applies to everything. Like knowing the study design is so helpful. So you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 5 sources of stress. That's how I used to do it. Like I used to remember study design stuff based on numbers. So like I would remember, okay, there are 5 sources of stress. And then I would just like go through, daily pressures, life events, a culture of stress, major stresses, catastrophes. So say you get a 10 marker on stress, when you talk about sources of stress, you have all 5 to go from, rather than being like getting to the 10 marker and getting to it being on stress and wanting to talk about sources of stress, but only remembering like 3 or 4 of them and you can't remember the other one. And that idea of knowing like, oh, I think, is there something like, is there 4 or is there 3? Like, I can't remember. Whereas like I like to remember it based on numbers. So I knew like there were 5 sources of stress, or I knew that there were 3 circadian phase disorders, stuff like that. 3 like sources of memory, for example. And then so I knew when I would like get into my 10 markers or my short answer questions or whatever, like I knew these are the 5 listed on the study design. These are the 5 I'm going to write about in my 10 marker. Or if it was a short answer question about, like describe one source of stress or something like that, I knew, okay, these are the 5 I have to choose from. I'm going to write about this one. It just kind of helped me with that like reassurance that I'm not leaving anything out, especially when you come to the 10 marker. Yeah, okay. Sorry, so yeah, I know we're not talking about that in detail, but understand, life events, a culture of distress, so on. Okay, so the fight, flight, freeze, we talked about this a little bit in neurotransmission. Understand this, it's really important, both eustress and distress, and that it is the sympathetic nervous system. It's a really common VCAR multiple choice question asking about, it's like someone is experiencing eustress, which nervous system is dominant, and that idea that a lot of people won't choose sympathetic because they associate sympathetic with the fight, flight, freeze and with distress. But it's a really important point that whether it's positive or negative stress, you're getting the same like arousal and activation of the body. So that's your sympathetic nervous system. So really think about that. However, when we think about the freeze response, I know we talked about how it's like scales, like the sympathetic is dominant, and then when you calm down, the parasympathetic becomes dominant. With the freeze response, to be honest, like not a lot is known about the freeze response, like it's kind of random. But it's this idea of, instead of the sympathetic being up here and the parasympathetic being down here, it's this idea that the parasympathetic for some reason becomes like a lot stronger and they're almost like in contention with one another, which is why you get that freeze response, because your heart rate can kind of drop a little bit. Instead of your muscles being mobilized, they're kind of frozen. It's this sort of stronger parasympathetic dominance than compared to fight and flight. Again, scenario-based questions are common, as it is for like all of psych, but obviously the fight, flight, freeze response, very, very, very common. It's rare to get one that's not really scenario-based. So be specific, apply it to the scenario, and a clear statement. So this is kind of, I suppose what I was talking about, like with the 5 marker, when sometimes you guys may routinely find like, you're getting 4 marks out of 5 or often 3 marks out of 4. And you're not like pushing it to that last statement. Often it's this idea of speaking about the direct consequence or cause and effect. So sometimes it's really easy to talk about the content, but then you don't tie it into like the final statement almost, or because sometimes they can be heavily implied, or like even the outcome, maybe what is written in that question, if that makes sense. Like it may say, here is a character and whatever happened here, maybe like they have anterograde amnesia or something. So it'll say like the outcome, and then, your short answer will obviously be involved in terms of like discussing anterograde amnesia and, short-term memory or whatever is involved there. But you may miss out on that mark because like simply you don't tie in the final consequence, or you talk about the cause but not the effect. So it's really important in your short answer questions, make sure you're speaking through every step, especially when it says, like explain this or how this leads to this. Don't forget to be explicit, particularly in that last mark, because sometimes that's what students tend to forget. Or if it's 5 marks, you will put in 5 marks worth of explaining the first 3 marks, if that makes sense. And you'll forget all, you won't realize that you needed to talk about 2 separate things to get those last 2 marks. So try to, plan it out. Planning can be really helpful for that, to make sure you're stepping through a clear answer. Okay, so in terms of the HPA axis, this isn't too high yield, I would say. It's not the most important thing. It is in textbooks and stuff like that, but I wouldn't focus on it too much, honestly. But HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, adrenal glands, it's just that process. So the hypothalamus basically detects the changes. So the amygdala tells them, okay, there's a threat. We've understood that now. So the hypothalamus is involved with coordinating. So the hypothalamus recognizes that and then tells the pituitary gland what to do. The pituitary gland is the actual like kind of director, if that makes sense. So like hypothalamus will think about the response, will actually think about the idea. The pituitary gland doesn't think about anything of its own. It just waits for the hypothalamus to give it directions, but then it tells it what to do. You can kind of think like that. Like the hypothalamus maybe is like some kind of like CEO, and the pituitary gland are like the worker bees. I don't know, something like that. But it's like the hypothalamus will give the directions and the pituitary gland will enact it, basically. So this will release a hormone that activates the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will release ACTH, and then the adrenal glands will actually release that cortisol and the adrenaline, which is what kind of gets our fight-flight response, or our stress response sort of going there. So the most important part of this really is just to understand like adrenaline and cortisol, basically. But again, it's not the most important thing about psych. Okay, so Selye's gas model of stress, this is our biological model. So understand alarm, resistance, exhaustion. So we basically have shock and counter shock. So this is first exposure to the stressor. So shock, basically everything drops, heart rate drops, everything drops. You can kind of almost like freeze a little bit as the body first encounters that stressor. The body then realizes, okay, we need to fire up, we need to destroy the stressor or handle the stressor, overcome this stressor, yeah? So then we get everything going back up. So our heart rate goes back up, blood pressure goes back up, everything like that. And our body basically tries to mobilize everything to fight this stressor. And we can see that our line here is like our body's normal resistance to stress, and this just rapidly kind of increases. So after alarm, if our stressor is still present, we then go into the resistance stage. So this is when the body is working really nice and hard to try to overcome this stressor. So when we're thinking about, say you have your test or like your exam coming up maybe, your body's entering this resistance stage, and we can see that we're focusing on dealing with this stressor. So we have our prolonged like cortisol release here. So the cortisol is what I suppose enables us to fight this stressor, because from a biological context, the role of cortisol is to basically increase like blood glucose levels. Because remember, we're thinking about dealing with the stressor, kind of overcoming it. It's this idea of cortisol helps by increasing blood sugar levels, essentially, like mobilizing that blood glucose to use for energy, stuff like that. So that's helpful. But ultimately, when it's prolonged, when we have this prolonged release, and this long-term exposure to a stressor, cortisol is maladaptive in the way that it weakens our immune system. So this is when we start to see, like coughs and colds. So often around SAC week, sometimes exam week as well, which is why hopefully you guys aren't stressing too much. We start to see, students getting sick. So getting coughs, getting colds, because the immune system is weaker because of this prolonged stress. But like it's fine, the body's kind of dealing with it until that stressor just gets too much, basically. And so instead of continuing to resist, our body is basically depleted. And that's when exhaustion comes in. The body's just physically exhausted. It can't handle being in this extreme state of stress resistance, essentially. And so we get this plummet in everything. And that's when we start to see more extreme sickness. So you might be susceptible to pneumonia, stuff like that, like hospitalizations, heart issues kind of coming into play and stuff like that, when we see this really long-term exposure to stress and when the body has just reached its limits, essentially, which is why we see that kind of plummet below the normal resistance to stress. So understand with Selye's gas that it is good in describing stress as a biological thing and describing how stress, isn't just a mental thing and there's an actual physiological explanation for it, but understand as well that it kind of underplays the psychological aspect. It's primarily tested on rats, so that's a bit of a drawback as well. Some good things about it, the fact that it is kind of tested like experimentally, so that's good as well. But yeah, understand, have about like 2-ish or so strengths and limitations for Selye's gas and also for Lazarus and Folkman's model as well. So this is our psychological model. So we contrast this to Selye's gas, which is very physiological. This one is more psychological. So in terms of walking through this, we have our stressor. So exposed to it, we have our primary appraisal and our secondary appraisal. So our primary appraisal is basically just, is this stressful? Yes or no? How is it stressful? The secondary appraisal is, how am I going to deal with the stressor? Will I be able to deal with it? So we experience stress, primary appraisal, the simple yes or no. So either it's irrelevant, benign, positive, so therefore it's not going to cause us stress, or it's stressful. If it's stressful, is it a harm, loss? Is it a threat? Is it a challenge? Once we've done this primary appraisal, again, think of the words primary. So like first appraisal, we're appraising something, we're evaluating something. So we've done our primary appraisal. We now move on to our secondary appraisal. So our second evaluation basically. And this is, now that I've realized that this basically could be stressful, what kind of resources do I have? Are they adequate? How am I going to handle this? And so if the coping resources are adequate, so this may be emotion-focused coping, problem-focused coping, you're not going to feel that stressed. If your coping resources are inadequate, then that stress is going to come, basically. A really good thing with Lazarus and Folkman's model is this idea that it accounts for reappraisal as well. So realizing that, what was once initially stressful may not be stressful anymore. When coping resources were inadequate, maybe now they're adequate, or vice versa. So it's this idea of reappraisal that can kind of highlight how stress is a perception thing and how it can change as well. Something good is that it also accounts for individual differences, unlike Selye's gas, which is a very one size fits all. It's, every single human ever, their body goes through this. Whereas Lazarus and Folkman is, some people may perceive it this way, other people may perceive it that way, and stress is a relatively like subjective perception almost. But with Lazarus and Folkman, it is difficult to test because of this kind of subjectivity and this very psychological aspect of it as well. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of differentiating between them. Okay, in terms of some definitions for coping. So again, with these two, think of the names. It's in the name. Context-specific effectiveness. It's basically how effective this coping method is to the context. Is it specific enough, really? So it's this idea of your coping strategy matching the stressor and therefore being effective. So if you have a test coming up, it's obviously causing you stress. If your coping strategy is to study for it, then that's showing, a high level of context-specific effectiveness, because that coping strategy of studying will be effective for managing that specific stressor. On the other hand, coping flexibility, this is when realizing that your coping strategy isn't working and being able to adapt. So you've got a coping strategy and you've realized, okay, I'm still feeling stressed, I'm feeling even more stressed, or I'm just not getting where I want to be. Having a high coping flexibility is is a really good thing, because then basically you're able to recognize, okay, I'm going to try something else and maybe that will be more effective. So maybe, using a coping strategy that has greater context-specific effectiveness, for example. So obviously if you have a high coping flexibility compared to someone that doesn't, you're more likely to handle that stressor efficiently and effectively. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Slido poll time. So we'll look at question 3. What is a weakness of Lazarus and Folkman's model? So what do you think? Looking pretty good. Yeah, give you a couple more seconds. Yeah, okay. I reckon that's enough. Sorry for anyone that hasn't gotten their questions in or their answers in, but yeah, really good from everyone. It's hard to test experimentally because of this idea of the personal aspect of it. It's hard to test whether someone is in, primary appraisal or secondary appraisal and how they're evaluating, because it's a very personal thing. So it can be relatively difficult to test. Pro of it is that it does account for individual differences. This is a limitation or a weakness of GAS, Selye's GAS model, because that was predominantly tested on rats. And if anything, the Lazarus and Folkman's model underemphasizes the physiological response. Remember, GAS overemphasizes the physiological response, and Lazarus and Folkman basically overemphasizes the psychological. So then the opposite is true in terms of Lazarus and Folkman underemphasizes the physiological response. Okay, but well done there. Okay, getting onto our last one of this content block. So learning and memory. In terms of classical conditioning, really important, just basically understand what happens at each step here. So the way I think about it, when I get like a short answer in classical conditioning, I literally just write in the corner like UCS arrow UCR, NS like arrow nothing or something. And then for example, like after conditioning, CS arrow CR, like just having that little formula like just at the side can really help you and can really direct you in terms of your short answer questions. And that, as long as you remember that in terms of what elicits what before conditioning, what elicits what during conditioning, what elicits what after conditioning, as long as you remember that, that's seriously like the foundation of classical conditioning. And it's what we can see right here. So you're basically unconditioned, learn, like it's unlearned, it's innate, conditioned, learned. So if you just think about conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, unconditioned response, it tells you what it is, if that makes sense. So the unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response. It's innate. It's reflexive. It's not learned. So salivation to food for Pavlov's dogs, yeah? Not natural. Neutral stimulus does not elicit anything. So neutral stimulus, the bell, doesn't cause anything, yeah? During conditioning, your neutral stimulus and your unconditioned stimulus are paired together. Food and the bell are presented together. So therefore, the salivation, that unconditioned response, this association between that unconditioned response and the neutral stimulus are occurring because it's constantly being presented with the UCS. And notice this idea of repeated trials. So after enough trials, after conditioning, the neutral stimulus is now referred to as the conditioned stimulus, and that elicits the conditioned response. So the learned response. The dog has learnt to associate the bell with food. It's a conditioned stimulus, it's learned. It's a conditioned response, it's learned. So something important with this is to remember that the NS and the CS are the same. Always remember that. Just remember the acronyms or the stimulus, with the 2 letters, as opposed to UCS, which is 3 letters, that they're the same. NS and CS are the same, but understand when to refer it, when to refer to the NS as the CS, which is technically only after conditioning. Also an important thing, the CR and the UCR are the same in terms of the response. So it's important that you explicitly state what it's in response to. So the UCR is salivation. The CR is salivation, but the UCR is salivation to the food. The CR is salivation to the bell. So in your short answers, make that clear. If you're getting like a kind of in-depth answer on classical conditioning, you have to make it clear in terms of salivation to what. CR is the response in response to what? Because just saying salivation, it may imply to the examiner that you don't know what you're talking about, even though you do, because you just haven't specified it. Another thing as well, because I'm sure it'll come up, UCS, UCR, like referring to them as acronyms, you have to define them first. The general rule of thumb is if it's abbreviated on the study design, abbreviate it from the get-go, but if not, you have to define it first. So on the study design, EEG, EOG, they are abbreviated. So it says electroencephalograph in brackets EEG. So in any of your answers in your exam, you can immediately write EEG. You don't have to write electroencephalograph and then define it. But the other terms are not. So unconditioned stimulus, it's not abbreviated on the study design. So if you are going to use these acronyms, you have to write it out and define it first and then use it. So you would say the unconditioned stimulus in brackets UCS, and then for that question onwards, you can just refer to it as UCS. That's something that comes up as well. Okay, in terms of operant conditioning, we have our ABC, antecedent, behavior, consequence. So antecedent, I just think of it as stimulus, really. So antecedent is basically what is going to trigger that behavior. Behavior is that behavior. Remember, it's voluntary. Compare that to classical conditioning, which is involuntary, reflexive, unconscious. Operant conditioning, it's voluntary. The learner is active. It's a conscious response. And then the consequence is what occurs as a result of performing that behavior. And that consequence will determine how likely the learner is to perform that behavior again. So important with consequences, positive, negative, reinforcement, punishment. Think about positive and negative in a math sense, not in a, positive is good, negative is bad. Do not think about that. Think about it as in positive is adding, negative is minusing, really. So positive is giving something, positive reinforcement, giving something good, positive punishment, giving something bad, negative reinforcement, taking away something bad, negative punishment, taking away something good. The way that I do it is I just break it up into like the separate things first. So if I am asked to identify, what type of consequence it is, I don't think about, okay, is this positive reinforcement? Is this negative punishment? Is this positive punishment? In my brain, I think about, is this positive or negative? Is it reinforcement or punishment? It's just the easiest way to like systematically kind of get through it. So I always like to identify, is something being given or is something being taken away? Because that is usually pretty clear. And then think about, is the person performing this behavior again? Or is the thing being taken away or given good or bad? So is this going to make them more likely or less likely to perform the behavior? Okay, in terms of generalization and discrimination, extinction of spontaneous recovery, we have this for operant and classical conditioning. So again, it's in the name, generalization. You're generalizing, you're treating a lot of things as equal, basically. So in terms of a classically conditioned response, you're demonstrating that conditioned response to a range of similar stimuli, you're generalizing, versus discrimination, you're being specific to that one stimulus. So other similar stimuli, you're not showing that response to. Same thing with operant conditioning. Although with these four, we often see them more so in the context of classical conditioning. However, they still apply to operant conditioning, but like generally you see them more in classical. So extinction, basically this response is being extinguished. We've learnt this response and now we've unlearnt it almost. So basically the bell no longer causes salivation. We've extinguished this response. The association isn't clearly there. However, with spontaneous recovery, this tells us that somewhere deep down in the dog's brain, that association is still there because, a couple of days after the response is extinguished, you ring the bell and that salivation still occurs. It's not as strong as it originally was, but it's still there, which tells you that somewhere those neural pathways are still kind of connected. So that's spontaneous recovery as well. Okay, and then so moving on to observational learning. So we have MISTER, that's how I remember it. Basically reinforcement and motivation. They're almost treated as one stage, or they can be reinforcement motivation or motivation reinforcement. I remember it as motivation reinforcement, but again, this is just based on another like method of thinking. And then some kind of combine motivation reinforcement together. I tended to treat it separately, but VCAT is aware of this like discrepancy. So just go with whatever your textbook tells you, whatever your teacher has told you, really. But attention, retention, reproduction, again, motivation reinforcement is what I think of it as. So you can remember that acronym as MISTER, basically. So attention, basically you're looking at the individual or looking at the model, you're paying attention to them. Retention, think of retaining something, you're memorizing, you're creating this mental representation of the behavior. Reproduction, you're physically and mentally capable of reproducing this behavior. Motivation, you want to reproduce this behavior. Reinforcement, you're kind of like rewarded for reproducing the behavior, which is why motivation and reinforcement kind of tie in, because often the motivation for learning this behavior is reinforcement, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, identify one similarity and one difference between operant conditioning and social learning theory. So social learning theory is just another term for observational learning. But think about this in terms of a similarity and a difference. Again, I'll give you like a couple of seconds just to think about it. So operant conditioning and observational learning. Okay, so we can see here again, 44% got 0. So one similarity and one difference between operant conditioning and observational learning. So both forms of learning rely on consequences. So we see the word reinforcement kind of mentioned in both, and it's voluntary behavior in both, but that observational learning is this idea of vicarious learning. You are not directly kind of acted upon. So this idea of looking at reinforcement motivation, you are watching somebody else's behavior and you're seeing them get reinforced, and that's what's encouraging you to do that behavior because you think you'll be reinforced as well. Whereas operant conditioning, you are the person getting reinforced. So other things as well, the learner's active, and again, contrast this to classical conditioning where the learner is passive, motivated in both forms of learning, voluntary motor responses as well. Other differences, so your ABC of operant conditioning versus your Mr. of observational learning as well. Okay. So we'll now go to a Slido poll, but hopefully that makes sense. Again, anything that needs further clarification, pop it in the Q&A. Okay, we'll try to get through this one quickly. And again, based on what I've just said, like there are, I guess, 2 accepted answers. Just a couple more seconds. Yep, okay. Awesome, yeah, it's looking good. So attention, retention, reproduction, motivation, reinforcement. Obviously, with that acronym, like Mr., there are 3 R's. So it's important that you recognize what comes first. So it's this idea of attention, your retention comes first. Retention is just memorizing. Reproduction is being able to enact that mental representation out. And then obviously reinforcement kind of coming last. And understand, yeah, motivation and reinforcement can be kind of linked together, but I like to remember in this order. Yeah, so technically, like you can say it's 4 steps, but I like to do ARRMR. Okay, awesome. Well done on that one. Okay, so going on with our multi-store model of memory. So really important, sensory memory, short-term memory, and our long-term memory. The main thing with these is knowing the duration and the capacity. So iconic memory, very short, in terms of 0.3 seconds, 0.4. Echoic is a little bit longer because of this idea of kind of comprehending a sentence. That's how I like to think of it. And iconic is really short because think about like how a movie is just like a bunch of pictures played in a row. It's the same thing with like your perception of the world. Like your memory of what you're looking at is really brief. So it seems as if it's smooth because, you know, it's kind of your memory of your visual things that you're looking at is so brief that it looks smooth when it's kind of like a movie. Like you're just seeing frame after frame after frame after frame. Okay, in terms of short-term memory, duration, capacity, both relatively limited. Sorry, did I mention capacity is unlimited for sensory memory? So it's this idea you're like basically bombarded with everything like filling your senses in terms of visual and like oral information. So it's this idea that having it being brief is very effective in making sure that you're not kind of overwhelmed by all of that. So when you pay attention to something in sensory memory, it'll then go into your short-term memory. So the duration is about 12 to 18 seconds, but up to 30 seconds, and your capacity is 7 plus or minus 2, so 5 to 9 items. So very brief. Anything longer than 30 seconds won't be in your memory anymore. Anything more than 9 items won't be in your memory anymore. In terms of your long-term memory, if you basically encode and consolidate the information from short-term memory into long-term memory, then the duration and capacity are virtually unlimited. Again, it is very difficult to test capacity and duration of memory, but from what we know, it's assumed that it is unlimited. Okay, in terms of types of memory, so this is your long-term memory specifically. So we're thinking about stored memories here. You have your explicit and your implicit. So your explicit is the ones that require conscious recall. Implicit is kind of unconscious. So implicit, we're thinking about our procedural memories. So our memories that are basically involved with like our how-to, our how-to memories really. And also you can kind of fit under there your classically conditioned memories as well, because that doesn't require conscious recall. In terms of explicit, you have your episodic and your semantic. So episodic are episodes of your life, personal experiences. Semantic is your knowledge of general facts, general knowledge, just semantics, like things like that. So your content of like the psych curriculum, for example. Okay, in terms of the amygdala and the hippocampus and these important brain structures, we know the amygdala is really key in the formation of emotional memories, and we can see that from the diagram up the top. Noradrenaline is involved. The main thing to think about is adrenaline, though. So adrenaline basically stimulates the amygdala, and think about the situations in which adrenaline will be released. We're thinking about high like excitation, like high stress, that fight, flight, freeze response. We've got high levels of adrenaline going. So the presence of adrenaline, basically signals the amygdala, and the amygdala realizes, okay, like this is an important memory. So the amygdala then tells the hippocampus, which is really involved with consolidation and encoding. Amygdala tells the hippocampus, I've got a really important memory, like we have to remember this. And that's why we tend to remember emotional memories particularly well. So we can see emotional memories, classically conditioned fear responses as well for the amygdala, because of the adrenaline. We can see with hippocampus, super, super important, explicit memories from short-term into long-term memory. So this idea of consolidation or encoding, but really key, explicit memories from short-term to long-term. Not really that involved in implicit memories. Implicit memories is more so amygdala and the cerebellum. Super, super, super important. I really want to emphasize this. The amygdala and the hippocampus do not store long-term memories. Please like burn this into your brain, because it's a question Vika asks all the time, and it often tricks students up. Amygdala and hippocampus really involved with this idea of encoding, consolidation, but not storage. So really, really remember that. Storage is involved with these two. So the cerebral cortex is that storage of explicit memories. So the hippocampus, it's in charge of turning short-term explicit memories into long-term explicit memories, but then it ships them off to the cerebral cortex, basically. It stores them in those different kind of areas of the brain. The amygdala, again, encoding those emotional memories, kind of fear responses as well. The cerebellum, the encoding and the storage of your implicit memories. We particularly think of like your procedural memories, as well as like classically conditioned stuff too. But super, super important. Hippocampus and amygdala not involved in storage. Okay, in terms of our retrieval, we have recall, recognition, and relearning. So these are in order from least sensitive to most sensitive. So recall, basically just think short answer question. So serial recall in order, free recall, short answer question, cued recall, you're given hints, recognition, multi-choice question. Relearning is sometimes a tricky one to think about, but it's basically this idea of when you learn something for the first time and you think you forget everything. So I like to use the example of a language. So say you do a language course, it takes a year, and you learn that, right? Like, so it takes a year. A year later, you forget the language, you don't know anything. I ask you, what does this word mean in this language? You can't tell me. You can't tell me using cued recall, free recall. You can't tell me using a multiple choice question. You don't know, the language at all. And then I'll get you to do the same language course that you did before, right? But instead of taking a year, it takes you 9 months. So the idea that you have learned this 3 months quicker than you did the first time, that suggests that somewhere down deep in your brain, there's memory of this language because you learnt it quicker. So that's the idea of relearning, and that's why it's the most sensitive form of retrieval, because when you can't recall it using recall or you can't recall it using recognition, relearning suggests that somewhere deep down in your brain, you knew, what the word for door was in that language. Yeah, so that's what that kind of means. Okay, Slido poll. So the next one here, rank the retrieval methods from least to most sensitive. Yeah, okay, so almost. Yep, I'll give you some more time to think about it. Yeah, okay, so I'll leave it there for now. So yeah, almost with this one, the idea is actually serial recall is less sensitive than free recall. So it goes serial recall, free recall, cued recall, recognition relearning. So we'll have a look here again. So you can see serial, free, cued, recognition relearning. So I know it seems a bit strange maybe because like serial recall can be thought of as like a hint, but it's just the idea that yeah, people are able to recall more when they don't have to do it in order. Which I know, yeah, can kind of seem a bit odd. I don't know. I feel like doing it in order may seem even more helpful. But yeah, that's what studies have found, and that's what is accepted. That yeah, serial recall is the least sensitive type of retrieval, and then yeah, you would generally be able to recall more using free recall. I suppose maybe because you're not restricted by recalling it in order. So like if you remember the last one, you know, in that order, then you can get that versus serial recall. Having to organize it in an order can be a little bit tricky. I think perhaps like maybe if we think about the recency effect, that may play into that as well. When we think about the serial position effect, remember that as well. That's really important in terms of primacy effect proving long-term memory, recency effect proving short-term memory. So perhaps if you're given a list of words and you're asked to recall it in order, that can be a little bit trickier because you basically won't be able to recall some of those words at the end that you'll be able to get in free recall. Does that make sense to everyone there? But yeah, good job with that Slido poll. Okay. So before we go into our break and answer some of the questions, here is a little promo that we're doing for TuteSmart. So I talked about TuteSmart at the start of the class or the start of the lecture. So TuteSmart is basically our group lessons. So we have 1.5 hours, so 90-minute classes, online in a group setting. So I mentioned I do psych and bio. So I do the psych 3-4 class on a Tuesday at 6. So if you think that that might be helpful for you, especially just before this exam period, we have this little like revision kind of package. So it's 379, and basically when I do the class, I do it at 6 every Tuesday. I recorded the class, and then, you know, students that weren't able to make it, or if you want to watch it again, can watch it back. So you'll get access to all of those classes. So like we're in week 35 this week. So all the 35 classes that I've done, you know, since like January, you'll be able to access them. And obviously you can also attend the live classes. We have a couple more until your psych exam. And you can choose up to 6 subjects. So within this $379 package, you can choose basically all your other subjects. Yeah, so that's what you get access to. So essentially you're signing up for the last couple of weeks, but then you also get access to the previous recordings as well as all of the resources. So worksheets, practice exams, flashcards, anything like that that we use as well. So if you're interested in that, then feel free to have a look. Also, if group classes are not really your thing, private tutoring can be helpful as well. So you can do this again in the last few weeks leading up to your exam. So if you are interested in private tutoring, these are 60-minute online classes with obviously just one tutor. So you can book an info call if you think that would be better for you than group classes if you would like. Okay, it is break time. I think maybe I'll answer like 1 or 2 questions until 2:15, and then we'll take a break. So I'll answer a couple now. I said at the end that I would answer questions from like 3:15 onwards, but I can see there are a couple. So maybe at 3 o'clock, like maybe I'll devote half an hour to it. We'll see. Okay, so brilliant question. Again, this came up a lot during the first Slido poll that we did, time management for questions during exams. Okay, so I would recommend 30 minutes for the 10 marker. And then the way I did it chronologically. So I went multiple choice, short answer, 10 marker, because I knew I was an overwriter, like still am, but I knew if I did the 10 marker first, I would just get like swallowed up into the question and I'd end up spending like 45, 50 minutes on it. So I saved it for the end. And yeah, about 30 minutes, if not, like perhaps I might have had more. But what I would do is 30 minutes, just allocate that 30 minutes. And then say I had more, right? So say I finished my multiple choice and my short answer and I had 45 minutes left. That's great. But I wouldn't spend all that 45 minutes on the 10 marker. I would stick to my 30 minutes and then I would double check. So I would double check my work, make sure everything from multiple choice and short answer is good. And then anytime I had left after that, then I would go back and do my 10 marker. So then if I had 5 minutes on the end, then I could tack anything on the end that I wanted to, but I knew I wouldn't, like if I did the 10 marker at the start, I knew I would think like, oh, I have so much more to write, I have to write this, and I would just get sucked into it really. So if you're an overwriter, I would recommend doing the same and keeping it to the end. But yeah, half an hour for the 10 marker. Obviously, it's up to you guys. If you can do it in less, then that's fine as well. If you think you really, really need 40 or 45, then you can do that, but make sure it doesn't come at the sacrifice of other questions. Because the thing I think is like 10 markers are notoriously hard, right? And we all want to get the most marks that we can out of that. But think about if you spend an extra like 15, 20 minutes earning maybe like 2 or 3 marks on that 10 marker, how many short answer questions could you answer in 20 minutes, right? Like you could get like 7 marks out of that. So don't sacrifice too much in terms of your 10 marker. Time management for questions during exams. I think the multiple choice used to take me around half an hour as well. I can't remember exactly. But I know because it's 50 questions, but you can usually get through them quicker than 50 minutes because like there'll be sets. So you'll get a prompt and then there'll be like 3 or 4 questions on that same prompt. So you kind of end up working through it a little bit quicker. But I think for me, stuck to around 30 minutes. So then I remember in 2019, and I think everyone said this on like VC discussion space and stuff like that too. Like I remember it took me longer because it was just a little bit harder, the 2019 multiple choice. So I think usually it would take me 30 minutes, but I think maybe in that exam it took me like, let's say 45. But again, then I wasn't too worried because I think I usually had time. But still then that meant with short answer, I like tried to keep pretty on the ball. So then I don't know, what does that leave? So 30 minutes for multiple choice, about 30 minutes for the 10 marker, that's an hour. So then you have about 2 hours left. So then, I would do like an hour and a half-ish, let's say, for short answer. And then I would try to save like 10 or 15 for double checking, if not triple checking. And then whatever the extra time is, like devote that to the 10 marker. Or, if you have a tricky question in short answer, you can come back to it. Stuff like that. So I hope that kind of helps. And again, I went in chronological order. So I went 30, let's just say 30 minutes multiple choice, 1.5 hours, 1 hour and 45 minutes on short answer, half an hour on 10 marker, the rest for double checking and for spending time on the 10 marker or spending time on short answer questions that I didn't know how to do, stuff like that. Okay, it's 2:14. I think I will answer the rest at the end, but I'll devote like half an hour to it. So I reckon if we can come back at 2:25, let's say 2:23. Sorry, I know that's not a long break, but let's say 2:23. And then we'll try and get through that content block by 3, and then I'll answer more questions in the last half an hour, if that's okay, for everyone. Okay, so come back at 2:23. So in 8 minutes. Pop in any questions you have in the meantime. Hi everyone. Hopefully, hopefully you guys are all back from your break. Sorry, it's a little bit shorter. Um, but yeah, we'll try and get through this second content block nice and quickly. And then so we can answer some of your questions. Okay. So before we get into the second content block, firstly, just like to talk about some of the stuff that I was mentioning at the start. So we have a little thing going with our Ed Unlimited and with our bookstore. So here are some good pictures of what Ed Unlimited looks like. So you can see what I mean by the Netflix sort of thing. Like basically you have access to all of the ATAR Notes publications. Yeah, just within Ed Unlimited. So then you can open them. So like anyone doing special maths, I don't know, you can open that. And then it will have your little course notes. You can annotate them. This one is an example of like topic tests. So you have topic tests available as well. So you'll have them for psych, and then you can just annotate them and things like that as well. You can access it on your phone, your iPad, whatever. So if you want to try that out, see if you like it, we have, I think, where it will be free for 3 weeks. So you get 21 days free. So you just make an account. Basically, you go to edunlimited.com as the website says there. And then you can put in Lourdes VCE, so just Lourdez. And just note that that is available until the 16th of October. So if you're not sure about it, you don't know if you want it now or later. Yeah, if you do end up wanting to try it free for 21 days, just make sure you do it before the 16th of October, because after then, you won't be able to access it anymore. But yeah, so basically you get 3 weeks of it. So you can just have a look and use that as preparation for some of your exams. So if you are less of an online person and you prefer the actual hard copy, especially with like topic tests, like you prefer to write in them, the Bookshop offer, you can get 15% off with the code 15SEP. So again, available until the 16th of October. So you can see like the text guides for English down the bottom. Those are kind of what I was referring to before. And then you get your course notes and your topic tests as well, for all of these different subjects. So yeah, feel free to check that out if you prefer the hard copy stuff, or again, you can access Ed Unlimited for the online stuff for free as well. Okay, so moving on to part 2 now. So we're looking at consciousness, sleep, stuff, mental health. So in terms of normal waking consciousness and an altered state of consciousness. So normal waking consciousness, basically everything that's normal. We think of being in class, working, stuff like that. An altered state of consciousness is basically anything that isn't that. So most of the day, about 2/3 are in NWC, and then the rest you can kind of think about sleep is our predominant like altered state of consciousness. And these can be naturally occurring, or they can be induced by like taking a substance, or naturally, by sleeping. So in terms of attention, we have selective attention and divided attention. So basically selective, this idea that you are being selective with what receives your attention. So you are basically looking at one stimulus at the expense of others as well. So you're focusing on this one thing, you're being selective, so much so that you're blocking out other stimuli. Whereas divided attention, basically you're able to devote your attention to multiple different things. So you kind of focus on them a little bit less. You can kind of see this as multitasking. But yeah, you divide your attention to 2 different things, 2 or more different things, really. Okay, in terms of controlled and automatic processes, so this kind of links into the stuff with attention, but a controlled process is a little bit more similar to selective attention. So thinking of high mental activity, mental focus, consciousness, and we are putting it into this certain task. So usually the task will be new, will be difficult, you're learning something, example, driving for the first time. It's a controlled process. You basically have to put all of your mental effort, energy, awareness into this task, in contrast to an automatic process where you barely even register that you're doing it. It doesn't take that much conscious effort, like tasks that are really familiar, that you've been doing for a while, or that are really simple. So like knitting for a while, if you've been knitting for a while, like knitting, people can talk while they knit, they can watch TV while they knit. This idea of it being an automatic process, you don't really have to think about it, compared to if you learn how to knit for the first time, that would be a controlled process. So you can usually perform multiple automatic processes at the same time. So again, that kind of aspect of multitasking as well. Okay, so this is a really important table to remember. Again, I used to think about 5 things to think about that are different. Again, this can be really helpful for a 10 marker when you want to think about characteristics that differentiate NWC and ASC. So in general, when you think about normal waking consciousness, it's things that are typical, normal, restricted, accurate, and altered state of consciousness is basically not. So the way that I used to remember this as well is I always compared normal waking consciousness, just being awake, to sleep. So obviously altered state of consciousness, it applies to all of them, but I always like to use sleep because obviously I sleep, so like it's something that you are very familiar with, but also because it's very different to normal waking consciousness. Rather than comparing like normal waking consciousness and like daydreaming, comparing it to sleep can be pretty clear. So content limitations, think of dreaming. So normal waking consciousness, you're pretty limited to what you think about. You can kind of think about things logically and normally, and you're not thinking too broadly. Whereas an altered state of consciousness, when you think about dreams, your dreams can be crazy. You can think about anything. So it's less restricted and it is more disorganized. Perceptual and cognitive distortion. So again, you have pretty accurate perception. You're able to think pretty well in NWC. Whereas in ASC, they can be kind of made more vivid, such as like taking like certain drugs and stuff like that. You can get sort of heightened senses, or they can be dulled when you think about meditation and things like that as well. Like with sleep, you would think of them being dulled, for example, a voice that you would hear in normal waking consciousness. If you're asleep, you won't be able to hear it. They're not going to wake you up. And same with cognition, you can have impaired problem solving, impaired memory, remembering your dreams, or if you're thinking about, being under the influence of alcohol, impaired memory, impaired decision making, stuff like that as well. Emotional awareness, again, you basically just have less control of your emotions, less awareness. You may express them inappropriately in an altered state of consciousness. Self-control, you basically have less self-control again. So think of someone who's drunk, like you can't really walk in a straight line. Less control over movement. Same with like when you're sleeping and you move around, like you're not really consciously moving around. And then lastly, time orientation. So again, when you think about sleeping, 30 minutes, a 30-minute nap may feel like 3 hours. It may feel like 5 minutes. Whereas in normal waking consciousness, generally 30 minutes feels like 30 minutes. So this is a really important table to memorize as well. Okay, sleep deprivation. So basically the context of learning this is this idea that we know that driving under the influence of alcohol can be really dangerous, and there are a lot of effects on driving ability, and it can be really harmful. But it's this idea that, if you have a friend and your friend is drunk and they say, okay, I'm going to go drive home now, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, you could never do that. Like, you're going to kill someone. That's really bad. But if you have a sleep deprived friend who says, okay, I'm going to go drive home now, you're going to be like, oh, okay, like, rest up when you get home, or, good luck or whatever, something like that. Because generally we don't really think of sleep deprivation being as detrimental to driving ability as we think with blood alcohol. So the idea with this study is that it kind of showed how equivalent they can be. So 17 hours of sleep deprivation basically is equal to the effect of having a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05, and then 24 hours equals a blood alcohol concentration of 0.1. So these are vital numbers to remember. Please remember these statistics. 17, 0.05, 24, 0.1. Remember those for this kind of context. Okay, so in terms of consciousness and stuff like this, please remember these definitions as well. Detect, amplify, and record electrical activity. Psych is not a very definition-based subject, but for some reason, VCAR are super uptight about this definition. So EEG, EOG, EMG. So detect, amplifies, and record electrical activity of the brain. For example, with EEG, EMG muscles, and EOG, remember, muscles that control eye movements. You are not recording electrical activity of the eyes. That's technically incorrect. It's the muscles that control eye movement that you're detecting the activity of. And so obviously, if those muscles are working, then your eyes are moving. But again, it's just being specific. And yeah, again, think about what your brain would look like when you're on a stimulant versus a depressant. And with EOG, you can think of like REM and NREM sleep. So a stimulant, basically we're thinking of increasing the activity of the CNS. We're getting an increase in our fast brain waves, our brain waves that are associated with, higher concentration, higher mental activity. So you're getting more of those beta brain waves that have a low amplitude and a high frequency, so fast and small. And you're getting less of our slower ones, like our delta, our theta, and so on. With depressant, it's basically the opposite, because we're inhibiting, we're depressing, we're slowing down the central nervous system. So therefore, we're getting less of those beta brainwaves that are associated with, high mental activity and stimulation. And we're getting more of those slower ones. We're getting higher amplitudes and we're getting slower frequencies. And so it's more of our alpha, our theta, our delta there. Okay, Slido poll again. Okay. So content limitations are less restricted in normal waking consciousness compared to an ASC. Getting the answers in. Yeah, maybe like 5 more seconds. Okay, yeah, brilliant. Awesome, yeah, so the answer is false. So they are more restricted in a normal waking consciousness. So just compare your normal thinking to your dreaming. The contents of your dream are really broad. You have less restrictions in an altered state of consciousness compared to normal waking consciousness. Okay. So going on to sleep now. So we have our REM sleep and our NREM. So REM, again, we think of like these sort of higher brain activity. I do want to make a point with this though. When we think about brain waves, we think of them predominantly in this context. I don't want you to focus too much on brainwaves in REM and NREM. I know it was in my textbooks. My teacher taught it to us. I'm pretty sure we were assessed on it in our SACs. But on the study design, it really outlines knowing your brain waves only in the context of stimulants and depressants. So not so much sleep. So I'm sure like most of you probably know this because for some reason it's taught a lot in schools and textbooks and stuff like that. But again, don't put too much emphasis on it. So with REM sleep, it's where our dreaming occurs. Again, we think about mental activity kind of with this one. And also this idea of paradoxical sleep, which is what kind of we're referring to in the second dot point there. So it's called paradoxical sleep because basically internally you're active, but outside you're frozen almost. So internally your brain is moving fast, dreaming's going on. You have like kind of your heart, like physiological responses are pretty active as well. However, your body is like ultimately paralyzed. Like you don't really move in REM sleep. So yeah, that's why it's paradoxical. NREM sleep, we think about our non-rapid eye movement. So think about what an EOG would show then. So we have our light stage, basically our transitional stage in terms of NREM 1. NREM 2, again, is our light sleep. We spend most of the time in NREM 2. And then NREM 3 and 4 are our deep sleep. So yeah, that's what we think about there. And the ratio is about 20 to 25% in REM sleep. So then about 75 to 80% in NREM. Okay, so in terms of our rhythms, we have an ultradian and our circadian rhythm. Please remember this. Ultradian rhythm is more frequently than once a day, basically. So we think about our sleep cycle. So one ultradian rhythm of our sleep cycle is going through REM and NREM 1 to 4, basically. So REM and NREM, when we go through that, so it's about 90 minutes, that is one ultradian rhythm. And then we would have about, however many, 4, 5, 6 of those, depending how long our sleep episode is. And so those are, however many cycles of REM and NREM we go through, those are our ultradian rhythms. So things about this is as the night goes on, as you sleep, the length increases slightly. So your last sleep cycle will be a little bit longer than your first one. Also, the ratio of NREM 3 and 4 and REM changes. So you have most of your NREM 3 and 4, your deep sleep, earlier on. As the night goes on, you get less and less and like barely any deep sleep towards the end. Whereas on the other hand, it's the opposite with your REM sleep. So you get really short periods of REM sleep to begin with. And then as the night goes on, those periods of REM sleep increase. So in terms of your circadian rhythm, this is your sleep-wake cycle. So this is once a day. You wake up and you go to sleep once a day. You have one sleep episode in terms of, your 8-hour sleep once in that day. An interesting thing to be aware of is that it's actually closer to 25 hours than 24. But it's very dependent on environmental cues as well. So particularly light, which affects the secretion of melatonin, but then also like, social stuff like school, work commitments, whatever. Okay, so in terms of sleep disorders, we have our parasomnias and our dysomnias. So our parasomnia is sleepwalking. Our dysomnia is sleep onset insomnia. Parasomnia refers to abnormal behaviors, hence walking during sleep. Dysomnia refers to the inability or the difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep. So with sleep onset insomnia, we're obviously focusing on that initiating aspect of the definition. So it's this kind of consistent difficulty to fall asleep like after you're intending to go to sleep. So you want to go to sleep, but then you're lying awake for like 30 or so minutes, if not more, consistently. So we set those apart from our circadian rhythm phase disorders. Again, this is where memorizing the study design can help, so you're not crossing over. But your circadian rhythm phase disorders, basically, this is a mismatch between your sleep-wake cycle and the desired sleep-wake schedule or the environmental cues. So sleep-wake shift, this idea of delayed melatonin secretion for 1 or 2 hours. Shift work, again, basically being awake in the night and, should be asleep in the day. And jet lag, this idea of, your internal, your sleep-wake cycle being matched to an old destination and not matching with the, again, environmental cues of the location that you're in. So mainly with this, it's just a mismatch. You're basically sleeping, later than you should be and waking up later than you should be, or, with jet lag, like sleeping earlier than you should be, waking up earlier than you should be as well. And so all of these can lead to sleep deprivation because when you think about adolescence, like you go to sleep later, but you have to wake up early for school and stuff like that. That leads to partial sleep deprivation. Shift work, not sleeping in the day, partial sleep deprivation. And jet lag, obviously sleeping at different times during the day can lead to partial sleep deprivation as well, and the effects associated with that, which we can see here. So we have our ABCs again, your affective, behavioral, and cognitive effects of sleep deprivation. So remember, these are from both poor sleep quality, so kind of not getting enough of like the stages that you need, as well as the quantity, so in terms of time. So affective, we're thinking about emotional, so all of those kind of things there, mood, irritability, stuff like that. Behavioral, we're thinking of, reduced like reaction time, thinking of micro sleeps, motor coordination. Cognitive, thinking stuff, so irrational thinking, impaired decision making, poor memory as well, stuff like that. It's really important with these questions to highlight what they are asking you, because sometimes it'll be, just name anything with sleep deprivation, but make sure you are realizing when they're asking you for, only affective impact or only cognitive impacts, because it's so easy to just breeze quickly through the question and then it asks for like 3 impact and you say, okay, 1 affective, 1 behavioral, 1 cognitive, but you haven't read it properly and they're only asking for behavioral, for example. So make sure you're reading it carefully. For this one, I would say remember about 2 or 3 of each. Probably 2 of each would be enough, but yeah, just make sure you're reading it properly. Same with multiple choice, you're identifying whether it's talking about affective, behavioral, or cognitive. So that's where highlighting really comes into play with questions like this. Okay, so in terms of your sleep intervention, so we have 2. Your bright light therapy is for your circadian phase disorders and your cognitive behavioral therapy is for your insomnia. So really remember that. So bright light therapy is basically exposure to safe levels of bright light. So we're thinking about, either exposing the light in the morning or at nighttime based on what you want with your sleep schedule. So if you're falling asleep really early in the afternoon, like having light in the evening to kind of push it forward, or if you're falling asleep really late at night, getting that light in the morning to kind of bring your sleep schedule back. In terms of your CBTI, so again, cognitive behavioral therapy, this is transferable with your mental health stuff, but cognitive aspects, correcting those maladaptive thoughts. So with insomnia, it's often this idea of anxiety, like you worry about not going to sleep and, all the kind of consequences of that. And then that actually makes you less likely to fall asleep because you're feeling anxious, because you're feeling worried. So kind of correcting those thoughts. In terms of behavior, stuff to do, like with sleep hygiene education, like, not using your phone before bed or not doing like, exercise right before bed, only using the bedroom like as a cue for sleep. So not studying in your bedroom, for example, not watching TV in your bedroom, like only associating the bed with sleeping, that idea of creating those cues. So those really important aspects. Again, it's the same principle of CBT that for mental health, but we're just applying it to insomnia. Okay, in terms of the purpose of sleep, we have our evolutionary theory and our restoration theory. So same with for example, like Selye's gas and Lazarus and Folkman's, know the limitations or the weaknesses and the strengths. So the evolutionary theory is basically this idea that we sleep for protection. It's this idea that by sleeping at night, we're avoiding dangers because we're not like interacting with the environment. Honestly, in my opinion, it's like kind of an odd theory, but this idea that kind of goes with the light cues as well, like why we're active in the day and then less active at night. But this idea, it's kind of this for survival, really, in terms of promoting survival by not like being active during the night. In terms of restoration theory, this is the idea. Basically, I think of it as like plugging your phone into the charger at night. It kind of treats our bodies in the same way. So we've depleted all our resources. We're at a battery based on things that we've done during the day. And then at night, we basically get recharged. The thing here is it treats REM as like restoration of mental capacity, I suppose, like mental restoration, and NREM as physical restoration, so more the body and stuff like that. I know pros and cons. So evolutionary theory, a big con is this idea, like if you are asleep, that can be maladaptive because you'll be less aware of predators and stuff like that. Restoration theory, evidence for is this idea that babies have a lot of REM sleep because of their brain growth. Marathoners have a lot of NREM sleep to repair their bodies, stuff like that. But also this idea of both of them aren't really that good in saying like why we have to sleep, why everyone must sleep, because even individuals that don't do any physical exercise, like perhaps those that are bed bound, like they still get NREM sleep. And animals, like all animals get sleep, regardless of whether, they're predator or prey and stuff like that. Okay, so tips for sleep, know your graphs for sleep over the night. That can be helpful as well. Like your general kind of graph for what a sleep episode will look like with the cycles involved in your REM and NREM, and also sleep over the lifespan. So understand how infants vary from adolescents, who vary from adults, who vary from the elderly. That's really important. Interventions as well. Just remember bright light therapy, circadian phase disorder, CBT, insomnia. The understanding of why. I feel like I've tried to emphasize this, but this applies to all the other areas of study as well. Like figuring out why stuff exists and or not why stuff exists, but why stuff is, and kind of zooming out and thinking about sleep as well as learning and memory, especially like on a bigger level, can kind of help you understand like the small little aspects of it, if that makes sense. And I know this is like lame, but making sure you get enough sleep as well. And I suppose this ties into stress a little bit that we talked about. You guys have a month. It is a high stress time. I know. Prioritize sleep, prioritize health. Like there's more to life than the psych exam. So don't burn yourself out and push yourself beyond your limits, really. Okay. On that note, Slido poll. So what are some effects of partial sleep deprivation? So this is a word cloud. So we had our huge table there before. What can you guys think of? So we have our affective, our behavioral, our cognitive. What do you guys think? Brilliant. Irritability. Yep. Awesome. Slow reaction time, sleep inertia, fatigue. Yeah, I remember with fatigue, like fatigue is accepted, I guess. My teacher used to like hate anyone saying fatigue, and I feel like it's kind of stuck with me a little bit. I don't know, because it's just the idea that it's like the effect of not getting enough sleep is being tired, almost. It's like saying that when you say fatigue. I don't know. So personally, I would say like other stuff, other more explicit stuff, like irritability, poor decision making, what else is that? Yeah, mood swings, stuff like that, as opposed to fatigue. But I don't know. I think Vika would be okay with it, but I know some teachers aren't. But like me, if I was an examiner, I don't know how. Like I feel like fatigue is a little bit of like a cop out maybe. So I don't know. I would go with something else. But I don't know if it works for you. You can go with it as well. Yeah. So yeah, definitely what I was saying before. Like just remember 2 from each category. And yeah. Smiling is an effect of partial sleep deprivation. Okay, but yeah, dead. I mean, I guess. Okay. Yeah, hand tremors. Yeah, looking pretty good here. Okay, awesome. But yeah, just remember again, have your go-tos. It just makes it so much easier. And in your 10 marker, again, if you can say like 2 from each, like what's that? That's 6. like symptoms already. And if you can relate it to the scenario as well, then that's brilliant. Like you've done more than enough. Okay, so now quickly moving through mental health in the last couple of minutes. So being mentally healthy, we know this idea of characteristics that mentally healthy people technically have. So according to the study design, so you do have to remember these as well. Again, I used to remember that there were 3, like /4, because of the social and emotional well-being. But yeah, social and emotional well-being, high level of functioning, and resilience to life stresses. So we think of those characteristics being kind of typical of someone who's mentally healthy. Understand as well what the first dot point says. Being mentally healthy does not mean that you just don't have a mental health disorder. That's this idea of the continuum that we see down below. We are always gradually moving, up and down. It's not you're mentally healthy, you're in the mentally healthy box, you're in the mental health problem box, you're in the mental health disorder box. It's going up and down this continuum. So understand that not being mentally unhealthy does not necessarily mean that you are like the perfect definition of mental health. Okay, so in terms of ethical implications associated with participants that have mental health disorders, informed consent and the use of a placebo are what we look at. So informed consent must be obtained by a guardian, a legal guardian. If the individual with mental health disorder, because the individual with mental health disorder, basically you can't guarantee that they have fully, obviously it depends on the mental health disorder, but, haven't fully understood the study. So therefore you have to get it from the legal guardian. However, this is an important part. You need to explain it to the participant in detail. You have not obtained ethical, informed consent if you just explain it to the legal guardian and you don't even tell the participant with the mental health disorder at all. You have to explain it, obviously, to the legal guardian, but you have to explain it to the the participant with the mental health disorder, as best as you can, to their best ability of understanding, and then obviously get the actual written legal consent from the guardian. But yeah, that's a really important point as well, because sometimes the question may be, who do you get consent from? How does it happen? And it's easy to just say the guardian, but you need to describe this explanation to the participant as well. Okay, in terms of the placebo, again, it is allowed and it's done in experiments with participants that have mental health disorders. However, it's just this idea that it has to be ethically approved for 2 things. One is this idea of withholding treatment that may work. So if you're trialing a drug, some will be in the experimental group, some will be in the control group. It's kind of like if you're in the control group, this isn't nice to kind of withhold a medication that particularly works. But the main thing is that particularly, again, if they are in the control group, they will have to stop taking their own medication, and that could be pretty detrimental because then that can lead to exacerbations of their symptoms and certain episodes and stuff like that. So that's why it is a kind of big thing to discuss in terms of ethics. Okay, in terms of risk factors, you have internal or external risk factors, so originating within oneself or from the environment. We have our 4P risk factor model, but again, one of those P's is protective factors. The biopsychosocial model in terms of them all being equal. This is an important thing as well. With our risk factors, it's important because we remember stuff based on if they're biological, psychological, or social. But the model itself is important to understand this idea that they all interact equally. Again, very common VCA multiple choice question. Which one is correct? Biological is much more influential than psychological, or social is much more influential than biological. Understand that they all interact together. They're all separate spheres, but they all interact and influence mental health equally. Understand cumulative risk as well, this idea of being exposed to a number of risk factors and how that really increases your chance of developing a mental health disorder. Okay, super important table. The most important thing are the rows as opposed to the columns. I think the columns are still important, but it's vital that you're able to class them in terms of biological, psychological, and social. So we won't talk through all of these in detail, but it's important that you are able to class them in those categories and understand the definitions of the 4 Ps as well. So your protective, obviously, these are reducing the likelihood of developing a mental health disorder, but understand as well, predisposing, basically increasing the risk, increasing the vulnerability to developing a mental health disorder. Precipitating is the same thing as predisposing, except it also occurs basically just before the onset of that mental health disorder. So it can kind of like really almost like immediately trigger the mental health disorder. So if you think about genetic vulnerability, it's that idea that it does increase your risk of developing a mental health disorder, but it doesn't mean like, everybody that has a genetic vulnerability for schizophrenia is going to get schizophrenia. Whereas like precipitating, if you have a loss of significant relationship, you can see how that big event could really like trigger or kind of occur almost immediately before the onset of a mental health disorder. And again, think of the words predisposing versus precipitating. And then perpetuating something, maintaining something. So this basically, maintains the mental health disorder, but also prevents treatment, prevents the individual from seeking treatment, such as stigma or poor response to medication. It prevents the treatment of that mental health disorder. Okay, so this is another important table or two tables to look at. Again, biopsychosocial, really important. With specific phobia, the thing is the interventions tend to match a contributing factor. So when you think about GABA dysfunction, like benzodiazepines, it's like that immediate match. Relaxation techniques, with stress response. Psychoeducation with stigma. So they often are kind of like matched, so you can remember it that way. But again, important to remember biological, psychological, social. As a hint as well, because there are obviously a lot of factors to consider when we combine these tables. If you see the word risk factor, in general, think about it referring to these kind of risk factors for mental health in general, like the stuff that we see here. If you see the term risk factors, if you see the term contributing factors and interventions, this is kind of a hint that we're talking specifically about specific phobia, because on the study design, that's how they're referred to. Risk factors for general mental health disorders, so our previous table, and contributing factors for specific phobia. So that's just kind of like a little hint. Okay, so in terms of, I guess, differentiating between stress, anxiety, and phobia, main thing is phobia is a diagnosable mental health disorder. Stress and anxiety are normal in certain amounts. They're normal reactions, feelings to have, as well as this idea that they can precipitate or they can lead to mental health disorders, but they aren't mental health disorders in themselves. And importantly, this idea of the difference between stress and anxiety. Stress is this idea of physiological or psychological arousal for any reason, whereas anxiety is this idea of apprehension, worry about something happening in the future. So remember that stress can include like eustress, whereas anxiety, it's obviously negative and it's specifically for something that's going to occur in the future, like this worry of potential future consequences. So really think about that as well. Okay, another Slido poll quickly. Where are we? Okay. Which of the following is a psychological perpetuating risk factor? So perpetuating risk factor, that is psychological. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, good. So there's like a little bit, I guess, of debate on this one, but the answer here is rumination. So I'll lock the voting. It is rumination. We think about this being perpetuating. So this idea of ruminating on something, thinking negatively about something. The main thing with this idea of rumination is it impairs treatment as well. So we think about rumination, basically this constant negative thinking about the negative aspects of your situation, all the consequences, stuff like that. But importantly, not doing anything about it. So it's fine to think about, the negatives of a situation or like certain consequences if that prompts problem solving, right? But with rumination, it's this idea of dwelling on really negative things and not doing anything to correct, the situation. So that idea of rumination. So therefore it's really perpetuating in that sense that it, I guess, like prevents treatment. So stigma, we think about it being social, Poor response to medication is biological, and poor self-efficacy, we think about like, as it's a personality trait, it is psychological, but I think more so predisposing. Let's see here. Yeah, predisposing, because of this idea of poor self-efficacy. So again, sometimes with stress and like poor sleep and stuff like that can be predisposing / precipitating almost. But yeah, with poor self-efficacy, we don't necessarily think about it like, again, it technically like could be perpetuating, but we think about it more so being predisposing because of this idea that it's like a characteristic of oneself. If that makes sense. Like it can be worked on, but it's like really a personality trait. So that's why we term it as predisposing. But yeah, rumination is specifically perpetuating because of this idea. It just maintains that mental health disorder and prevents recovery. Okay. Okay, so moving on to scientific skills and exam. So it is 3 now. I think I'm going to skip the scientific skills stuff because the slides are very thorough, basically. So I think you'll be able to refer to them. And I'd rather get through some of the questions and then you guys can look at the slides in your own time. So we'll look through this. I'll try and walk through them really quickly and then we'll get to the exam tips to talk about them in general as well. But yeah, hopefully that's okay with everyone. If we have time after the questions, then we can come back. But just because they are very thorough in terms of the scientific skills stuff, I think I'll leave that for you guys to look at in your own time. So iPod, really important, independent variable, dependent variable, population, vital for a psych hypothesis. Operationalization just means being specific in terms of your variables. So independent groups, basically E group and your C group, one or the other. Matched participants, you pair with someone based on a similar characteristic, so that kind of reduces your individual participant differences. And repeated measures, the person just does the same task. They're both in the E group and the C group. Obviously, order effects is a big thing because of that. So therefore we counterbalance. So instead of 20 participants doing the E group task and then the next day doing the C group task, because that could lead to them performing differently just due to the fact that they're doing it in order, we get 10 people that are doing the C group task and then the E group task, and then the other 10 are doing the E group task and then the C group task. So that idea of counterbalancing prevents the order effects because they're basically both, they have it in a different order. So you can't say that the results obtained are due to an order effect. Okay, extraneous and confounding, basically anything other than the IV that causes a change in the DV. Therefore, you cannot conclude anything about the relationship. The whole point of experiments is to figure out what is the relationship between the IV and the DV? How does the IV affect the DV? If you have a confounding or an extraneous variable, that whole objective is like destroyed really, and your experiment is useless. Okay, so in terms of placebos, this is for your control group. So when you're taking a drug, right? So for drug trial, people in the experimental group, the act of actually taking the placebo, that will lead to them reporting improvement in symptoms, regardless of whether the drug has done something or not. Versus if you're in the control group, you're not taking any drug, right? And the individual realizes, I'm not taking anything. I'm not going to expect to report any better symptoms because I'm not getting any medication in me. So therefore, that's what a placebo is for. A placebo is basically so that both groups are experiencing this like psychosomatic thing of taking the actual tablet. So then any difference that's reported between them is due to the drug itself, because both of them are experiencing this slight improvement in their symptoms. That's ultimately due to just the like act of taking a pill. Does that make sense? Because I know placebos are a little bit tricky. So it's not that you're canceling out the participant expectations. You're not, making it that they don't have any participant expectations. You're just making both of them equal. So the participant expectations that the E group has from taking the actual pill, you're giving those same participant expectations to the control group. So you're balancing it out. That makes sense. Okay, experimenter effect, basically the experimenter skewing the results to what they want. So single blind, double blind. Single blind, participants don't know E group or C group. Double blind, both the participants and the experimenter. Sampling, so random sampling, stratified sampling. Convenient sampling, just a big thing to know with convenient sampling is you can't generalize. Should be random allocation. So qualitative, quantitative data, again, you guys should know this. Mean, it's just the average. Standard deviation, you want a small or a low standard deviation because it means your results are clustered around the mean, which is much better than having, you know, a really broad range. Like some participants got really low, some participants got really high. That suggests that your experiment is probably a bit bad. Reliability, how consistent your method is. So you repeat it over and over again and should be getting the same results. Validity, basically this idea of, does your experiment actually test what you want it to test? You know, you're saying that you're determining the relationship between the IV and the DV. Are you actually doing it properly? In terms of generalizations, again, these are the things that you have to meet. Importantly, convenient sampling, big sample size. This is a really important slide. Refer to it again in your own time, but basically it's just improvements. So order effects, counterbalancing, convenient sampling, not convenient sampling, individual participant differences, increasing the sample size. So there are some ones there, so think about these. We'll skip that for now, but the answer is B. Okay, ethics, this is important. So security, confidentiality, so no identifying information, voluntary participation, participants should not be coerced, withdrawal rights, they should not be punished for withdrawing from the experiment, informed consent, so again, we've kind of talked about this, but really important, the entire nature of the experiment, all the details that you can give them, unless you're using deception, then obviously then you don't need to tell them all the details. However, you have to debrief them at the end and reveal the deception. And if deception is to be used, it has to be approved by an ethics committee, and it has to be the only, the only option really. Like without deception, you couldn't be able to do it. And the benefits have to be more than the cons, as with every kind of experiment. Okay, I think I'm going to skip the slider poll for now because I think it's on scientific stuff anyway. So we can get to the questions. Okay. So these are some general exam tips. Again, you guys will probably be into your revision or having just started it, but textbooks have so much information that is unnecessary. So use the study design. That's my biggest recommendation. And I've talked about it a lot, and I always emphasize it so much because it's really helpful, especially with a subject like psych. So use the study design and realize what you need to know from the textbook and what is just a load of rubbish that they're just using to fill up the space. Practice questions as well. I've talked about this, really important, especially your short answer and your multiple choice actually, because understand as well, 50 multiple choice questions, that's a lot of marks. So you obviously put effort into it, you kind of get back what you put into it. But yeah, really think about those application questions. And importantly, I'm sure we'll talk about marking, but when you do your practice exams, spend time marking them. Don't rush through it. Don't be like, okay, the answer was C. Sure, I'll remember that next time. Think about, why did I get this question wrong? What is my misconception about the content that led me to choose that? What did I misread? What did I approach wrong? Why did you get that wrong? Is it content-based? Is it question-based? Figure out why. And the same with your short answer as well. Why did I not get that last mark? Why did I, write this when I shouldn't have? Should I have planned this? Should I have highlighted this? Do I need to brush up on my content in this? Because I never would have gotten that. Yeah. Think you really need to put a lot of emphasis into marking it. Marking it is almost more important than sitting the actual exam. Okay. So the exams, I've talked about how I did it in order. Again, this doesn't work for everyone. Some other approaches may work better. Practice it and stick to it. Do not walk in on exam day thinking, okay, I'm just going to see which one I feel like doing. Have a set plan. Yeah, again, because psych is relatively early in the exam period, you probably have a couple more. You may have one the next day. I think it's on a Friday. I don't know if it's on a Monday. But you may have some in the next couple of days, if not that afternoon or if not the next day. When you plan to study, don't rely too much on being able to study well after the exams. Same with English. Psych is relatively soon after English. After the English exam, it's a lot, assuming if you guys do mainstream English. So don't be like, okay, I'm going to do this 3-hour English exam and then do 3 practice exams in the afternoon, because you'll be drained. You'll be tired. Maybe you might want to go out with your friends. Just be realistic. It's kind of what I'm saying. So 10 marker. So I set aside 30 minutes, plan it. This is my biggest tip. Plan it. Just plan it, because it's marked holistically. It is not marked. Your examiner does not go through and say, okay, yeah, they they did this, they did this, they did this. Okay, there's 10 of those, done, 10 marks. It's marked like an essay. The examiner reads it, sees how they feel about it, and then gives it a mark out of 10. It's marked holistically, so literally treat it like a little mini essay, but it's not as serious as an essay. So like I used to hate writing essays, so don't I say treat it like an essay, but you don't have to like psych yourself out thinking like, oh, it's scary like an essay. It's simpler than an essay. But yeah, just have a plan so you can be logical, and that comes into paragraphs and subheadings as well. Be as clear as you can. Maybe you're the 50th 10 marker your examiner is reading. If it's just one like huge 3-page block of writing and there's no flow or anything like that, and there's no set structure, it'll be a headache to read. Even if the content is good, like your examiner may just be sick of it. So be as clear as you can, how your topics connect. This is where study design really helps. Like I used to structure it based on the study design. So, almost like in order sometimes. So think about, brain structures together, and then all your, memory stuff together in terms of your Atkinson-Shiffrin stuff. And then, I don't know, if learning is in there as well, and, you have your learning models, things like that. Like, don't put classical conditioning at the start and then come back to observational learning at the end, or talk about long-term memory here and then short-term memory at the end, or context-dependent cues at the start and then state-dependent cues at the end. Like, be smart in terms of how you structure it so it's easy to read. Link to the scenario. That goes for every question, especially the 10 marker. I always like to say if there's stuff in the study design and it's relevant, like put it down. However, there is a fine line in terms of like word vomit and just saying random stuff. Like you need to relate it to the scenario as well. And so I've explained how I did it last, so I wasn't really wasting time on it when I had other questions to get to, because I did tend to overwrite. And yeah, double checking includes the 10 marker, so reread your response. Okay, after the exam, again, congrats, relax. Because it's early on in the exam period, as I mentioned, you probably have others to do. Be realistic though. If you don't think you'll have enough energy to do a practice exam in that afternoon, then don't do it. Just do a little bit of stuff. Just be realistic with how you're going to plan your study. And also try your best not to discuss it too much. I know like everyone says this, and sometimes it's hard because you want to talk about it, but it's just really unhelpful. Like you can't do anything about it. Just like wait a month or two, or however long it is, like a month and a half until you get your results, and you get it and it's fine. But like there's like literally nothing you can do about it. So I would avoid talking about it. And then you just make yourself feel bad, and then you just spend time thinking about it. So just ignore it and move on. Okay, so we will do a quick Slido poll just in terms of how you guys are feeling, and then we'll get right onto the questions. So how prepared do you guys feel for the exam? Obviously we'll answer some questions and hopefully you'll feel more prepared after that, but just in general, how are you guys feeling? So I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, is it like the 31st or like 29th? I don't know, it's somewhere around there. It's the end of October. So yeah, you've got about 4 weeks-ish or so. And that's a lot of time. That's plenty of time. Don't feel behind like the 8 ball or anything like that. You have time to get there, so don't stress, but start now if you haven't already, and be serious about it as well. Like draw up your schedule, have an actual plan. It's much easier to say like, I'm going to do this. If you don't get to it, it's fine, but it's better to have something to do than say, oh, I'm just going to play it by ear, and if I have access to this, then I'll do this, or maybe I'll do this. Like drop a plan. I like to do it going backwards. So like, 2 days before the exam, I wanted to do the 2018 one, and then 4 days before I wanted to do the 2017 VCAR exam, and then I wanted to do this exam and then that exam, and I worked backwards. And then I figured out like how I wanted to time my revision in terms of content as well. Okay, so sitting at around about a 6 or a 7, which I would say is pretty normal. Again, if you're up the 9 or the 10, then that's great. You can plan your revision according to that. If you're a little bit lower down here, again, 4 weeks is enough. The exam is really a priority. I think it's like 50%, if not 60%, of your score. The exam is the most important part, really. It doesn't matter if your SACs have been horrendous. It doesn't matter what your ranking is, what scaling is, whatever. Just put all your effort into this exam, and like you'll be fine. Or you'll be fine. But like, don't think, oh no, psych's already a write-off because I've done really badly in my SACs. It's like all in the exam. So if you like push really hard over these 4 weeks, or not, don't push too hard, but push hard enough that you are able to improve kind of your knowledge of the content and stuff like that, there's no reason why you can't do well on the exam. And you can boost your score a lot. Like, don't underestimate the weight of the exam. Okay. But yeah, kind of good to see, at least it's kind of on the positive end, just. But yeah, we'll answer some questions now. So we've got about 15 minutes. I'll try to get through as many as we can. If we don't get through one that you have like a burning desire to be answered, please feel free to email me. So it's just lourdes@tutesmart.com. So you can, when you get these slides, like the little code for Lourdes VCE, like you can get the spelling from there. But yeah, feel free to email me if I don't get to your question. What were you averaging in SACs, and how should I know what study score to expect? So very good question. In my SACs, I think they're about 90s, like either low or mid 90s. Like I never got a 100%. Scaling obviously contributed to it as well. I think my lowest, it was like research method stuff. I think it was like 75 or something like that, or maybe like 78. But then again, I think my school scaling contributed to that as well. So would have gotten a little bit bumped up. But generally, I would say, like A's or A pluses for my SACs. But again, in saying that, if you haven't done that well in your SACs, it's not the end of the world. Do not think that you shouldn't try for the exam because of your SACs. You can use study score calculators, but honestly, study score is relatively hard to predict because of this idea that like ranking and schools and like scaling and stuff does play a part. But you can kind of figure out what score you can get on your exam. I think there's like a document somewhere, and it tells, like, it's from VCO, and it tells you what your exam score will be in terms of like what an A plus is on the exam, what an A is on the exam. So then you can kind of think like, if your SACs are like say around 80s, so that might be about like an A, and say you want an A plus on the psych exam, then you can look at that kind of VCO document, and then it'll tell you like what, like based on last year, I think it's like based on 2021 data, what score would have gotten you an A plus. So it'll be out of like 120, but percentage wise, it might have been like 92 or something like that. So that can kind of help, and that can give you a clear goal for what you want your exam to be. But yeah, study score predicting, like you can use study score calculators, but they're not that accurate, honestly. But yeah, generally, if you have done pretty well, like there's no, I mean, like I can't really tell you what study score to expect because it depends on, how well you've done in your SACs and your school, and obviously your exam as well. But keep in mind, there are a lot of people that do psych. So there are a lot of people that get like above 40 or above 35, for example. So it's not like rare to get a good score, is what I'm saying. So again, put that effort in, and it's not like, you know what I mean? It's not like a far-flung like wish that will never come true. It is certainly achievable, 100%, if you put that effort into your exam. So hopefully that answers it. But in general, it's very hard to know what study score. Revision techniques I used. So I would suggest to you guys to do practice questions and anything that is really active learning. For me, I was in year 11 when I did my exam. So psych was my only 3-4 subject that year. And what I did was I actually rewrote my notes. I wouldn't suggest this, especially if you're in year 12. It's too time consuming and it's not a very active form of revision, but it did work for me when I was in year 11, when I had that time. Because in general, like there are two techniques really. So one, like the approach is kind of, like you revise all the content and then do the practice exams, or you do the practice exams and the questions that you get wrong, they prompt you to tell you, where your revision needs to be. For me, I chose the first one because in my head, I thought like I want to know the study design as thoroughly as possible, so there are no gaps in my knowledge. And then I use the practice questions as kind of like confirmation and consolidation. Whereas like if I were to do practice exams first, in my head I was like, oh, but what if I never come across a question that that like actually is covering content that I haven't done? You know what I mean? Like, because you're basically filling in the gaps. I was like, what if I have a gap that I'm not aware of? So I think in terms of revising the content, like, yeah, rewriting notes is a little bit extreme. Like, read over them. Perhaps videos. I really liked videos, like visual stuff. Teach it to other people. That was so helpful for me. I used to tell like my sister, my parents. I used to like teach it to them, and I think they like hated it. They couldn't care, but like I didn't care what they thought about it. Like, as long as I was teaching it and expressing it, so helpful. I found that a really, really good technique. Yeah. Mind maps, because the areas of study are so interconnected, and this can kind of help you with the 10 marker as well. They're so interconnected, so mind maps can be really helpful. Flowcharts and things like that. Flashcards, that is a really good form of kind of active recall. Like Anki, I don't know if you guys have heard of the flashcard thing, Anki. Like, a lot of my uni friends use it. I personally like hate it, but it's very, very good. But yeah, I would suggest that in practice questions. Practice questions 100%. Okay. Is it important to know definitions for each concept when answering questions? Also, should I dot point my answers? So yeah, as I was mentioning, with psych, it's not as definition based as like other sciences or other topics. So I think it's like, you don't need a glossary. I wouldn't say that. But I wouldn't like memorize definitions like word for word, but you need to be able to explain it, if that makes sense. Like, what's an example? Like, I don't think you need to know like the definition for classical conditioning, but you need to be able to explain, you know, what happens before conditioning and during conditioning. What else? Stress is maybe a definition that you should know potentially. But also it's important to think about things more so like, you know, like stress in terms of Selye's model or stress in terms of Lazarus and Folkman's. Like, it's more so explanation rather than defining it, if that makes sense. So I think like you'll know what you need definitions for, like stress, for example. But like, you know, you can't like define Lazarus and Folkman's model or like define the sympathetic nervous system, really. It's more so like functions are really important, like the function of the sympathetic nervous system, like the process of classical conditioning, the process of long-term potentiation, the process of synaptic transmission, rather than what is a synapse. Dot pointing your answers, I think this is a very personal thing. So I didn't dot point my answers. I preferred like full sentences, but there's no reason why you can't. I think especially if you are a little bit of an overrider, also if you tend to, say unnecessary things and stuff like that, dot pointing can be effective. So I think it is a personal thing. So do practice questions and you can use dot points and figure out if you're getting the marks. But yeah, I don't see why not. But personally, I didn't. I just never really liked like dot points. Like, it's again a personal thing. Like, since I'm, you know, like year 7, I don't like to dot point my answers. So it's kind of a personal thing. But there's no reason why you can't get full marks with a dot pointed answer, as long as you are being thorough enough. Because sometimes it's easy when you dot point answers because you're trying to be concise, right? But you don't want to omit key details. Okay, what percent should we aim for to get an A? Oh, yeah. So this is exactly what I was referring to. So there's a document. It's like, it'll be somewhere on VCA, the VCA website. Like, it'll be the 2021 exam performance or something like that. And it tells you exactly what an A+ is. I believe off the top of my head, because I looked at it like last week, I think it's something like 92% or something like that, I think, for an A+. And then I think maybe it's like 85% maybe an A or something like that. But again, I can't be super specific with that. But there is definitely a document and it outlines it specifically in terms of what percent to get. But I think off the top of my head, it's like low 90s for an A+ and like mid 80s for an A, I believe. I think. If a person averages A for Unit 3 for SACs, what will they need in the exam for a 40+ study score? I'd probably say an A as well. I would say an A on the exam would get you a 40+ study score if your average is A for Unit 3 for SACs as well. Again, I can't be like certain because I don't know the correspondence between the study score and the SACs. But I think A's on everything would be able to get you a 40. I would say so. It depends. Like sometimes if you get an A+ on the exam and you have like B+ in your SACs, then you can get 40s, if not like even mid 40s, depending on your exam score. And so the same might be true. Like if you get like really good SAC scores, but then you flunk a little bit on the exam, like maybe you get a little bit lower, then like you could still get a 40+ study score. I think as well. So it depends there. But yeah, if you got an A for Unit 3-4, I would say an A, so maybe upwards of like 85%. But again, I can't say this with like certainty, but yeah, I would say above an 85% would get you 40+. Potentially low 40s though. If you got an A+, that would probably get you into the high 40s. Okay, when referring to LTP and LTD, what is most correct thing to say? Honestly anything, but I would probably say synaptic connections. I would say neural pathways or synaptic connections. Synaptic pathways, because when you think about neural pathways, you think about multiple neurons like in succession. So like synaptic pathways is like, so I would say neural pathways or synaptic connections. Probably synaptic connections, because LTP, we kind of refer to it on a synaptic level. It's like the relationship between a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, and how that increased firing, it almost like pairs them together, and you get increased neurotransmitters, and you get increased like sensitivity of the receptors to those neurotransmitters. So that's like very synaptic stuff. So I would say like strengthened synaptic connections for LTP. But neural pathways, I say neural pathways all the time as well. But yeah, I'd probably say synaptic connections. But good question. Did you get perfect scores to get a 50? So no, I didn't. So as I explained before, like my lowest one would have been 70 something, like 75 or 78 or something like that. And I never got a 100. And I didn't get my exam scores back, so I don't know what like the specific numbers I got for my exam either. But I think I just did well on my exam, and then I think my SACs were like A+ as well. Again, like you don't know the specific number, but they wouldn't have been like 100. But I think they did get scaled up because of like my school and stuff like that. So yeah, so the answer is no, essentially. But I think I just did very well on the exam. But I was doing like relatively well on my SACs as well, of course. What's the difference between cortisol and adrenaline in terms of a stress response? Good question. So adrenaline is kind of the more short-term one, and cortisol is the more long-term one. So adrenaline is very involved with like the actual responses of the sympathetic nervous system. So like increased heart rate, like increased breathing rate, the pupil dilation even potentially. So adrenaline is really involved with like those actual responses, and it's released like it's a very immediate hormone in that way, quick acting. Whereas cortisol, we think more so of our long-term one, and its main thing is with that idea of blood glucose, to kind of increase the secretion or the release of blood glucose. And it's more of a long-term one. So where adrenaline is more quick and kind of those immediate responses, cortisol is more of a long-term one. And the main thing with cortisol is that idea that it can really impair the immune system and weaken the immune system and make us more susceptible to sickness, really. Good question as well. How many practice exams did I complete? I think I did around 10 or 8, potentially timed. I did all the VCAR ones timed. So I took mine in 2019. So I did 2018 and 2017 because they were relevant to the study design. I didn't do any of the ones before that timed. And then I did maybe like, that's like 2. Maybe I did like 3 or 4 more timed. Oh, actually maybe not even 10, like 3. I reckon I did like 3 or 4 more timed. And then a couple I did like just the multiple choice sections, or like just the 10 markers, because you get to a plateau. And I always say, like, I think people really do overestimate the number of practice exams that they think they need to do. Like, you don't need to do that many. The main objective, I think, with practice exams is confidence. Like, I can't overemphasize this enough. Confidence is really important. But obviously you have to have reason for confidence. So when you get to that kind of plateau, like after I was doing, let's say like the 5 or 6 practice exams, I was pretty happy with the scores I was obtaining. I was confident in my ability to consistently get them. And I felt, relatively confident with them. And I was very happy with timing as well. Timing wasn't an issue. So kind of ticking all those off, I was like, okay, I'm pretty good with the practice exams now. I think this is fine. But then I had like this chunky thing from school with all these practice exams. But I was like, I don't want to devote 2.5 hours because it drains you. You require a lot of stamina, like to actually do it and sit there. Like it takes a lot out of you. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to do the multiple choice section. Or I'm just going to do the short answer, sometimes timed, sometimes not even timed. Or I'm going to do the 10 marker. And then that helped me as well because, if I wanted to improve the 10 marker, I just did the 10 marker. I didn't do the whole 2.5 hour exam when I knew I was really confident in my multiple choice and short answer questions. So I would probably say max 10, like as in for you to do. I mean, again, it is personal. Sometimes the confidence comes from doing like however many dozen practice exams, but I would say a good number is like 6. Yeah. And like do all the VCons that are relevant for you, especially you guys, because you're the last year of this study design. So you have like almost like 5 or so VCA exams to use. So like make the most out of it. You guys are very lucky. Okay, it's 3:29. GABA, I think you can just refer to it as GABA. I believe on the study design it is abbreviated. So you can just call it GABA. You don't have to define it. I was going to say the HPA axis, I don't think I ever got a question on the HPA axis, so I wouldn't emphasize it that much. I wouldn't put too much thought into it. I think it's just in a lot of textbooks. I remember my teacher covered it briefly, but I don't think I saw it on a SAC and I haven't seen it on an exam. So personally, I wouldn't put a lot of effort into it. I just know like cortisol and adrenaline and maybe what HPA stands for. Okay, I think this will be the last one I answer because it's 3:30. Study methods for when you are feeling really burnt out. Awesome question. Really, try to avoid getting burnt out as well. This is like you've got 4 weeks. Try to balance it out and be really slow because burnout sucks. I definitely got burnt out around term 3 as well. But when you are feeling burnt out, study methods, don't do anything timed, I would say, because you just like can't think when you're burnt out and you put time pressure on yourself. It can be sort of maladaptive. So I wouldn't do any timed stuff. And like easier stuff as well. Like I would just do multiple choice questions. If I know I'm burnt out and my brain hurts, although I wouldn't be studying if my brain hurts, but like, just do simple things. Like just do some flashcards and do them in short periods as well. So I was talking about doing multiple choice sections. Like don't do all 50 at once. Do 5 at a time and then take a little break and then do another 5 and then take a little break. Do 10, do however many you can focus for, because the last thing you want to do when you're burnt out is burn yourself out more. I can't emphasize that enough. And if you need to, just take the day off. It's not the worst thing in the world. The worst thing in the world would be pushing yourself to the point that you get sick. Just make it easy for yourself. You know what you are capable of doing, and I wouldn't push yourself beyond that. And this is my, honestly, one of my hugest tips as well. Take a break when you need to take a break. I always took a break when I wanted one. I never, this goes for year 12 in particular, I never kept on studying when I knew that I needed a break. And when I had a break, like a half an hour break. And I, would take my time and try not to feel guilty as well. I don't know if it's just a personal thing. I never felt guilty for taking a break. And you should, if you guys feel guilty for taking a break, try to get out of that mindset as well. Because it's really unhelpful. So I'll just say slow and steady to prevent burnout, but also when you are burnt out, listen to your body, listen to your brain. But I would just do easy things with no time pressure. If you don't want to do questions, then don't do questions. If you do questions, I would do multiple choice. But otherwise I would do flashcards or something like that, or drawing a mind map, or reading, even just rereading your notes, something like that. Watching a video or 2 even, just to consolidate stuff when you're feeling really burnt out. But the first thing that should be a priority is not getting burnt out. But once you are burnt out, the biggest thing should be preventing further burnout. So literally just go so light. And again, if you need to take a break for 1 day, for 2 days, for 3 days, take the break, because you don't want to push yourself now or like 2 weeks in, and then by the time you get into your English exam and your maths exam and your psych exam and your legal studies exam, whatever exams you guys are doing, you're like completely dead because you pushed yourself too hard like 2 weeks before your exams. Does that make sense? Because you need the mental stamina as well to sit the exam too. So really, really, please prioritize your health. Take a break. And again, there's more to life than school. And I know it's easier to say as someone who's not in your position anymore, but you have to look after yourself. Okay, so on that note, I will let you guys go. Sorry for keeping you around for a little bit longer. I know there's so many questions we haven't gotten to. I'm really sorry. Please just email me, Lourdez, so Lourdez @tutesmart.com. Feel free to send me an email. Feel free to ask me anything. Hopefully this has been helpful. Again, you'll get a copy of the slides to look at the scientific skill stuff that we kind of flew through. But yeah, please let me know if you have any questions. But thank you guys for attending. I hope you have really great holidays and super, super, super good luck on your exams. I'm sure you guys will all do well. Yeah, so good luck. Thanks, everyone.